You describe yourself as an explorer of consciousness, physicist, and a scientist that has brought mysticism into science. You're mostly known for your My Big Toe, My Big Theory of Everything that unifies science and philosophy, physics and metaphysics, mind and matter, purpose and meaning, the normal and the paranormal, and the entirety of human experience, mind, body, and spirit, including our including both our objective and subjective worlds. Can you briefly describe yourself a little bit more and tell me what led you to develop My Big Toe?
I certainly can. Um, Although I would take what you said about that has brought mysticism into science and turn that around to say that has brought
Yeah.
science into mysticism, or at least physics into metaphysics, if you
Yeah.
like. But in any case, whichever one went into the other, we have a kind of a joining of those two, of the
Yeah.
physics and metaphysics, so that they're one continuous thing without any seams. Well, what got me involved in this, I guess it started very early in my graduate school career when I took a course. It was like a 1 or 2 week course of transcendental meditation as a student. I was a
Yeah.
graduate student at the time, at working on my PhD in physics,
Yeah.
and I immediately took to that very easily and very quickly. So I became then a regular meditator after that,
Yeah.
and that led me to find out that I could do much better debugging of computer code in a meditation state than I could wide
Yeah.
awake looking at the code. It was much more efficient. I could find errors in the code very quickly, um, and they were indeed the actual errors that were in the code. So it was, very evidential. So I knew then that there was more to reality than what I, the physicist, had thought about before. There was another component to this reality.
Yeah.
So then, I don't know, 4 or 5 years later, I happened to get an opportunity to go talk to Bob Monroe.
Yeah.
Now, Bob Monroe is author of Journeys Out of the Body. That was his first book. And after that, it was Far Journeys and then Ultimate Journey. And Bob had this experience of going out of body, when that, I think, was his term, out of body. Before then, it was called astral projection and some other things, but he called it going out of body.
Yeah.
And he, at first, was very frightened by it, tried to get away from it, and eventually decided that, well, it was here. He really wasn't crazy. He went to psychologists to try to determine
Yeah.
that, and he might as well just play with it, and see where it went. And then he wrote this book, pretty much like a diary of, here's what I did and here's what happened. So some people I worked with found out that he lived only, 45 minutes away from where all the rest of us lived, and where I was working. So they made connections, and I was in a group of people that went out to see, who is this guy? Is he
Yeah.
just spinning stories, telling lies to sell books, or what? So I went out and met him, and fortuitously, he was a very intelligent, analytical guy, and he wanted to study this phenomena so that it would become
Yeah.
real. It would become science rather than just this weird thing that happened to him. He wanted to understand it. So he had built a lab in which to study altered states of consciousness, and that's as far as he'd gotten. It's build it and they will come sort of thing. So he built it, and he was looking for a way to use it, to get people
Yeah.
to come and work in it. And he was looking for scientific people so that they could do real science. And so there I was, and he looked at us and said, and most of the people I was with were all engineers or scientists. So he asked if any of us wanted to work in his lab, and, I was a volunteer. So what I did then was spend the next, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years with Bob Monroe many times a week, many hours, probably about 20 hours a week, um, doing research into altered states of consciousness. And specifically, out of body was key because that was his experience. So that was a lot of time. You know, it's almost a half-time job at 20 hours a week. So that over 5 years is it's quite a bit of investment of time and energy into researching. And Bob Monroe taught us, I'll say us, it wasn't just me, another guy that I was with, Dennis Menerick. We both went out together. And Bob was also working with other people in the lab at the time as well. But he tended to keep us separate so that we didn't influence each other very much. He didn't want us to, kind of lead the witness so that we didn't end up saying things that what we were hearing, and other people didn't end up saying things, from us because they were hearing us talk about it. So it's better science if you keep your experiments isolated from each other.
Yeah.
So in any case, Bob did teach us how to do this out-of-body thing at will, and we began to explore that reality. Now, I jumped at the chance because I had this experience with transcendental meditation. I knew reality was bigger than what I had assumed before, and this seemed like an opportunity to understand it. I'm a scientist. That's what I do. I want to understand things.
Yeah.
So I jumped at it, and my thought was that, well, if it turns out that it wasn't really science and it was kind of bogus and Bob really wasn't, he was just trying to justify what he was doing or something, then I could just walk out, And if it turned out to be a real, honest to goodness, research into altered states of consciousness, then I wanted to be there because I knew there was something there to it because I had my own personal experience. So it was a great opportunity for me. I took it, and from that time on, I pretty much had 2 careers going. One in physics, and I'm a physicist, and one in researching altered states and consciousness. So that was a time right after, this actually all happened right after I had gotten out of graduate school.
Yeah.
So my 2 careers, I've had both started at about the same time. So my career in physics and my career in conscious research both launched, within a year of each other. And they have continued, to this day. So although I'm retired in my physics work now, I did that just a few years back, finally did get to retire because these books and these ideas are taking a whole lot of my time, and I'd rather put my time in here than there. So anyhow, that's kind of how I got into it, and my place, I guess, at the Monroe Laboratories, which they weren't called that at the time. There was no Monroe Laboratories. That later was a corporation, which is a legal entity that Bob created for this business that he could do that. That didn't exist then. This was just an informal research facility where we worked. And my part was as the theoretician, because that's what I did. That's basically what physics is. We want to understand the very basics about what's going on and how does it work and why does it work that way and what are the limitations, what can and can't be done, what does it mean. So that kind of was my thing, and that's what my physics training and my interest is why I went into the physics in the first place, was because that's the kind of thing I like to do, get at the understanding of things at a basic level. So then for the next 35 years, I continue to research altered states of consciousness. Only the first, let's say 7 of that was directly with Bob Monroe. And then for the next 10 after that, I was on the board of directors of Monroe Institute. But then after Bob's death, I just was on my own with that. So I spent, it was pretty continuous. There wasn't any time that it really set it down for a long period of time. And I kept trying to figure out, how does this work? How, to understand it. And then eventually I got to the point that I thought I had a pretty good handle on it, something that at least made good, logical, rational sense. And I put it in a book. Actually, I only intended to put it in I actually
Yeah.
intended just to write a paper. Then the paper turned into more, and then the books turned into 3 books.
Yeah.
So that's how they got written. So that's kind of the description of this theory, which
Yeah.
is really it turned out to be more of a theory of consciousness, but that theory of consciousness subsumes physics and metaphysics.
Yeah.
So when you have, and that's why I called it my big toe. Not because I was so proud of it, but because, one, it's mine, because if it's not your truth, it's not your reality. So it's just
Yeah.
my experience, and everybody else has to get there on their own. But it's a big toe because a toe, which is an acronym for theory of everything,
Yeah.
up until that point, a theory of everything has just been a theory that unifies quantum mechanics and relativity.
Yeah.
Because basically, if you unify those, then you've unified all of physics. And that was called a theory of everything. You've unified basically all of the understanding of the natural world. And this is a big toe because I have to do that. But besides, I have to also understand and have theory about the subjective,
Yeah.
about mind, about consciousness, experience. All of our experience is inside our head. All of our experience is subjective,
Yeah.
and we can't leave that out in a theory of everything that leaves out, all of our awareness is not good. So this is a big toe because it spans consciousness as well as the objective reality of traditional physics,
Yeah.
and it does it all in a logical process. It all had to make sense because that's my physicist brain. It all had to make sense. And in those places where you take guesses, the guesses had to be logical. They had to have reasons of why you go there. So that's how that's how a nice physicist like me ended up in a place
Yeah.
like this. It was just fortuitous that I happened to be at the right place at the right time with the right set of inclinations
Yeah.
and understandings, and actually it turned out to be better than expected because my first focus was on explaining consciousness and explaining the larger reality, not really to derive physics as well. It wasn't until after I had the books written that the light came on in an aha moment that, what I've done to explain consciousness derives
Explains
physics.
science. Yeah.
Yeah, it explains science, all the big mysteries in science that and not all the details, but all the big fundamental questions in science were all answered by the same theory that was generated to explain consciousness.
Yeah.
And all of my experiences that I had in the larger reality, which is what we call, when you are in an altered state of consciousness, you're in a different reality. So all of those experiences were then connectable to all of these experiences that we have in this reality. And I could see that the same consciousness theory would tell you why, particles are probability distributions, why the speed of light is constant, and so on. There's lots of, how does entanglement work?
Yeah.
All those things just kind of fell out of this theory of consciousness. So then consciousness is fundamental. That's at the root.
Yeah.
If you understand consciousness, then physics is a subset of consciousness.
Yeah.
It's that part of consciousness where the uncertainty is very small.
Yeah.
We call that the objective world.
Objective. Yeah.
It's not really objective because there's always some little bit of uncertainty. Objective means it's exactly like that, and it's objective.
It's an approximation, right?
Yeah, but it's just an approximation. It's not really exactly like anything. There's always error and there's always uncertainty around everything. But in the quote unquote objective world, that uncertainty is very small. So we all look at a rock and we all see it as a rock and we all measure it at roughly, 2 kilograms. but we measure it a little differently. There's
Yeah.
uncertainty because our instruments are only so accurate, and we're only, we're fallible as well. So there's some
Yeah.
uncertainty about that, how much that rock weighs and what it's made of and so on, because our tools are only but so good, and our understanding is only but so good. But anyway, we mostly agree on it.
Yeah. Yeah.
We,
Yeah.
we agree on the first 4 or 5 decimal places anyway, and maybe even out to 10 or 12 decimal places. But that's approximately objective, and that's the part that science and physics works with that part. But then consciousness has other parts to it as well. That's not
Yeah.
the only part. And
Yeah.
then these other parts allow you to derive not only understanding things that well, they used to be paranormal, which means outside and beyond normal. Now they're just normal. You can
Yeah.
see that those things are also explained for the
Yeah.
most part. Well, obviously not all of it. Some of it is bogus, but the stuff that's real, the stuff that people have
Yeah.
done experiments, the stuff that people for centuries have been experiencing, these
Yeah.
things get explained. And another thing that gets explained is theology.
Yeah.
You can then see, the threads of truth that run through most theologies.
Yeah. Yeah.
Most religious traditions have threads of truth running through them. They
Yeah.
also have threads of nonsense running through them.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the threads of truth are there too, and you can separate those. You see what the
Yeah.
truth is and what the nonsense is, and what makes sense and why it is they said the things they said. Why did Buddha say that this reality was all maya, was all illusion? Well, now that makes sense once you understand the nature of consciousness. Indeed, it is illusion.
Yeah.
And that then becomes science because it's
Yeah.
illusion in the sense of a virtual reality.
Um,
So anyhow, that's kind of the way it got started and how I
yeah.
ended up here. And the good news is for me is that 10 years ago, actually it's been more like 12 years ago that I first published these books. And by the way, to your listeners, the books are free on Google Books. You can go to Google
Yeah.
Books and you can get them for free there, but you'll have
Yeah.
to read them on your monitor. But anyway, at that time, myself and 2 other people that I knew of that were kind of in science and philosophy thought that reality was virtual, thought that
Yeah.
this reality was
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
simulation.
Yeah.
And now it's it is a bona fide
Yeah.
position in the physics community. So
Yeah.
it's grown tremendously in the last decade as far as it's not only its popularity, but its credibility,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
seriousness of it.
Yeah.
Every physics department on the planet has physicists in it thinking that virtual reality is really what we have to go
Yeah.
to
Yeah. Yeah.
because that's the only thing that explains the data.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Nothing else explains the data. So
Yeah.
it's not, and physicists really don't want to go there. That's not their
Mm-hmm.
favorite
Yeah.
concept,
Yeah. Yeah.
paradigm, but they're being pushed there by their own experiments. They
Yeah. Yeah.
see
Yeah.
they see particularly in quantum mechanics,
Yeah.
we see things that are just hard to understand, and we call
Yeah.
that weird science.
Mm-hmm.
But they beginning to realize certain things like an electron is not really a little chunk of mass with
Yeah.
charge, and with spin, it is a point,
Yeah.
like a mathematical point, and it has properties of mass and properties of
Mm-hmm.
spin and properties of charge.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, of course, the way we would describe an electron that was modeled in a computer.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
would we would model it as a point, and we would model it with these various properties. So that seems to be the way it really is, because as long as you treat it as a little chunk of mass with charge, you can't get the right answers.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It doesn't work that way. That's not how it works.
All right.
And so anyway, my take on science and my explanation of physics is getting more and more popular
Yeah.
over the last decade,
Yeah.
and I think is destined to continue until it becomes the accepted paradigm for understanding reality, because it's the only thing that works. It's
Yeah.
just better physics.
Yeah.
And even though it's going to be a hard thing for the scientists to swallow, it's a very bitter pill for them to swallow. They're going to swallow it because the data, doesn't give them any room to wiggle out from under it.
Yeah.
So it's good science.
Yes. Can you talk more about some of my big toes basic concepts like information, awareness, will, intent, consciousness, evolution, decision space, or free will? At least some of them, maybe.
Sure. In order to do that, I'll have to put them in context.
Yes.
And I'll best do that by just beginning with virtual reality and kind of working through the basic concepts of my big toe.
Yes.
And so I'm going to start with virtual reality. Virtual reality is an idea that our reality is fundamentally information.
Yes.
Now, another way to think of that is that our reality is computed. Okay, it's a simulation.
Yeah.
Just like we compute simulations and virtual realities, and then we play games like World of Warcraft and The Sims and dozens of other of these virtual realities. Well, then our reality then is very much like World of Warcraft or The Sims. It's a virtual computed reality. And the way that works is when you're playing a virtual reality video game, you are the consciousness.
Yeah.
You, the player with the mouse and the keyboard, are the consciousness. And as consciousness, you make all the decisions of what your character, your avatar, does. If you want your avatar to run or jump or stand still or whatever, it's your decision, and your avatar acts out your will. So you're the consciousness. And your avatar is living in a computed virtual reality.
Yes.
Okay. Notice that you, the consciousness, cannot be in the same reality as your avatar.
Yes.
Okay. If you're an avatar, the server that generates your World of Warcraft world, that the avatar interacts in, that server cannot be part of the World of Warcraft world. You see, the server has to be outside of the reality. It has to be in a different reality frame than the virtual world that it creates. So you, the consciousness, have to be in a separate reality frame from the reality frame of your elf running around in World of Warcraft. The two can't occupy the same space. Well, that's the way it is with us. We are individuated units of consciousness. That's what we are. And our role is just like you with the mouse and the keyboard. We make the decisions. We make the choices.
Yeah.
And our avatar, which is our body, basically in a virtual reality, which we call our physical universe, that's the virtual reality. It does, it moves or does whatever it is we, instruct it to do. Okay, so now we've come to the idea that our body is part of is an avatar. It's data in a virtual reality. We, consciousness, are not that. Our body is, but we, the decision maker and the choice maker, are individuated units of consciousness, and we and our body don't really exist in the same reality frame. We as consciousness. Now we think we do because we identify with that body. We identify with it. It follows all of our commands, and we are so close to it. It's so integrated with us that we tend to think of ourselves as the body.
Yeah.
That's us. But so this is that's kind of the first major paradigm shift you get to, is that we are consciousness, and consciousness exists in a separate reality from the body. The body is part of a digital virtual reality. So what that says is that consciousness is the computer. Consciousness is the server. Okay? or is, in our case, consciousness is part of a larger consciousness system.
Yeah.
And inside that larger consciousness system, a subset of it is dedicated to creating the virtual reality that we call our physical universe.
Yeah, yeah.
And we are subsets of that system. Okay, that makes now the larger consciousness system a digital information system.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Now, if you have an information system, information systems can evolve or de-evolve.
Yeah.
And in information, if you evolve or grow or become more, more functional, more useful, more choices, then that is tied to lowering entropy of the system.
Yeah.
Now you can think of a simple version of this is that low entropy means structure, order, content. High entropy means randomness.
Yeah.
So if you have a bunch of letters and they're just randomly thrown around, they're not in any particular order, you don't have any content. You don't have any meaning. All you have is randomness. But if you put those letters in specific order, you may have some content. You may spell something. They may symbolically refer, to some kind of concept or other. So through structure and order, we gain content and meaning.
Yeah.
And that's the way information works. So information evolves by structure, by creating content and order. And it de-evolves by having more randomness, basically letting that content go, letting it dissolve so you no longer have it. That would be the de-evolution, returning the bits to random bits rather than ordered bits.
Yeah.
Okay? So now we have a digital information system called the larger consciousness system that is evolving.
Yeah.
It's an aware system that is evolving. Okay? And in order to evolve, it needs to build content. Now, if it's just a monolithic thing, it's hard just interacting with yourself. I shouldn't say it's hard. What I mean by that is it's hard to create novelty. It's hard to create new content. It's hard to do something new.
Yeah.
If it's just you and you.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay? But if there's two of them, then they can interact. And that interaction will produce all kinds of novelty because each is an independent actor. And how they interact to each other then makes a lot of novelty. Well, if you break it into millions and millions of pieces and let them all interact with each other, now the possibilities of what might be created out of all of those independent, actors is tremendous compared to the possibility of what might be created out of just one monolithic thing. So the pressure of evolution, which is trying to, make the system have more content and more stable, that sort of thing. That's what things do, right? The things that make it better continue, and the things that make it not as good go away. That's the way evolution works. You're left with the winners, and the losers disappear. So this system then evolves. It's a consciousness system.
Yeah.
And it evolves by lowering its entropy. Well, how do you lower your entropy among a lot of individual actors? And those individual actors are us, you and I. We are the individuated units of consciousness that make up this larger consciousness system. We're these pieces, and we interact. And it's clear that it's this interaction is where the quality of the interaction, I guess, is kind of the fast track to the evolution. The secret of the evolution is in the interaction. It's how that interaction goes. And the next step I'm going to go to here is if you have this system of individual pieces, you have basically a social system. Yeah. It's a system of interacting pieces of consciousness. So each piece of consciousness is aware. It's it has awareness. It's an information system. It passes data back and forth. It's a communication system between these pieces. So basically then, what can they do? Well, if they create more randomness, if they basically, everything they say or do, the way they interact is just random, then it's hard to build anything on that. So they need to find ways to interact cooperatively, interact purposefully. Now, if you look at social systems and you say, okay, there's two kinds of purposeful interaction here that are at the extremes. And those two, I will break into the two parts, love and fear. Okay, now the love interaction would be one of cooperation, consideration. Basically, it's about other, not about self. How can we cooperate to build something, to create some content? Now the other one, fear, is all about self. Okay, I'm an actor and I have certain needs or wants or whatever. How can I get all of those met? And how can I get what I need and get what I want without any sense of whatever anybody else might want or need or whatever? That's not the point. The point is me. How can I do that? Well, if you have that situation, then you don't have things like trust. You don't have things even like cooperation, except for short periods of time. You don't have it for the long term, because we know about in those kinds of arrangements where everybody's out for themselves, sooner or later, even though you're part of this in-group that's supposed to trust each other and work together, somebody will feel that they've got the chance to take over the whole thing, right? They got the chance to take somebody else's. So it's never long-term stable. It always is falling apart, because all the people, even though they can cooperate for short periods of time on certain tasks, it never lasts or gets very deep, because they're all basically self-centered and are out just looking for themselves. It's not about other, it's about them. So you take the two groups. The group that's based on fear will start out just struggling with each other, trying to optimize themselves. They will then soon they will start to form cooperatives, you might call them defense packs, where groups are more powerful than single individuals. So if you're a group, then you can prey on other single individuals very easily. And if you have a bigger group, then you can go into lesser groups and take all their stuff or whatever it is they have that you want, or force them to do what you want them to do. So because if you're an individual, you need to join one of these groups, otherwise you'll get run over. So we start to divide up into warring groups. Well, that's called feudalism. That's where we were for a long time, where there was a bunch of warlords and a bunch of peasants that those warlords controlled, and that was the nature of our environment. And that's how we interacted with each other. Okay, well, think about how much content that builds as opposed to its opposite. Its opposite is the groups that are cooperative, caring. They're based on love. It's about other. What can they build? How can they construct and help each other? You see, that is a much more viable social construct. Love is a much more viable social construct than is fear. Fear tears apart. Fear is unstable. These groups are always changing. They're building up and then they're getting torn apart. And they're torn apart by other groups, and they're torn apart by their own from inside, internally. That's just the nature of it. So the fear group is basically a high entropy group. It's very hard to evolve a lot of low entropy content if you're based on fear. The love group optimizes the whole system for everybody, because everyone's mostly concerned about other. Okay, now that doesn't mean everybody's equal. That doesn't mean everybody does the same thing. It just means that whatever talents and skills and interests and things that they want to do or want to be, they can be and do that. They still individuals, but they do it in a cooperative way, so that people aren't trying to abuse each other. They're trying to be helpful to each other. All right, so then we get to the point then that this idea of consciousness evolving by lowering its entropy can be restated as consciousness evolves by becoming love. You see, that's that transition.
Yeah.
Okay, and that experience, of course, is the best teacher. Experience meaning interaction,
Yeah.
between these individual units of consciousness. That's the way to evolve, through this interaction.
Yes.
Well, interaction, when you're just trading data, doesn't have a lot of traction to it, because it's hard to tell, really what's going on and how you're affecting somebody else. You're just sending them data,
Yeah.
and they're just sending you data, and there's not a lot of traction on that. You can build on that.
Yeah.
That you can build that into something cooperative. So how do we make a more efficient place for us to evolve? We create a rule set. We create a game. We create a way of interacting with each other, so that we can share more of ourselves. And you might know how the information you sent affected that person. Well, that rule set, by definition, is a virtual reality. Now, virtual realities can come in all sorts. They can be very loosely defined with just a few rules, which might just be communication protocols, right? That may be a minimum set of rules, or they can have a lot of rules that define all sorts of interactions,
Yeah.
different levels of interactions. Okay, so we have this rule set, and we give this rule set initial conditions, and then we push the run button and we let it evolve. Okay, I call that the big digital bang.
Yeah.
Okay, it's modeled then on the Big Bang, starting with a small spot of very high temperature, high pressure plasma that then, because it's high pressure, it explodes, if you will. It pushes itself out, and as it cools, it coalesces, and then we end up with stars and planets and all the universe. So that's the Big Bang theory of the universe. Well, this works very similarly, except it's in a computer.
Yeah.
So it's a rule set, which is basically our science. How things interact. What are the rules for transferring energy between pieces? That's basically it. So that's our physics.
Yeah.
And you have this rules, and you start with initial conditions, like that initial in temperature and pressure and size, and all of that starts. You give it a place to interact, which is another part of your rule set, a 3D, playing board or game reality, if you like. Make that 3 dimensions of space. And you push the run button and you let it evolve. And as it evolves, you end up with our physical reality, which is a virtual reality, which is evolving in a computer.
Yeah.
And as it evolves, then all the rest of it we know, right? You eventually get the right kind of chemicals happen to build and come together at the right conditions, and you end up with a living cell. And that living cell is very, very limited. Maybe it's a virus, maybe it's becomes a bacteria in time. You have that kind of a thing. But eventually, evolution keeps working the problem, and you end up with us here, sitting in our respective houses, talking over Skype.
Yeah.
So that's just evolution works that way. So that's how we end up with a virtual reality, a computed reality.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, the science, as I said, is coming to understand that this is a computed reality, that this is just that information is fundamentally at the root of what we're doing. But that then begs a big question, and this is why scientists are not real joyous about coming to that conclusion, and that's because the question then is, well, if this is a virtual reality, it can't be computed in the same place. It can't be computed inside the virtual reality. It has to be computed elsewhere. Okay. And it has to be computed by something. It doesn't just spontaneously start to compute itself out of nothing. So then, where and who are the questions. Where is this being computed, and who's the programmer? Who's doing the computing? Well, the answers to those questions is where it's in a different reality frame, as it has to be. It's not part of this physical reality.
Yeah.
And it's this larger consciousness system.
Yeah.
Now, I kind of jumped over some of the origins of the consciousness system. Where did it actually come from? I just started out here with the consciousness system.
Yeah.
But if you want all that detail, it's in the books, it's in some of my talks, and at the end, I'll give you some places you can go to look to follow that. But there is a very rational process for coming up with the origin of this consciousness system.
Yeah.
And it follows pretty well the same logic of coming up with that first cell that created, evolution on our planet. It's a very similar kind of set of arguments, and we're pretty comfortable with that set. So it's the other set isn't any bigger stretch. Matter of fact, the set that comes up with the larger consciousness system is more math-based and probably more logical than is the one that comes up with the first cell that ended up creating all the living and growing things on our planet here. So let's see, where are we? So we've talked about let's see,
information. We talked about consciousness, evolution as well. Maybe we can talk about maybe decision space and free will. Would you like to say?
Okay, sure. So let's talk about. I'm going to make a mention here. We are kind of jumping in on a very high level brush over this. This simulation is not a deterministic simulation. The simulation of our reality, and I call that PMR, physical matter reality, and it's based on a rule set, and the rule set is very detailed, but it's not efficient to build a big virtual reality that's deterministic. It just takes too much computer resources. It's a very inefficient way of doing it. Instead, the efficient way is to make it probabilistic. So it's a probability and statistically generated virtual reality. Okay, and so I wanted to mention that. The second thing I want to mention is free will. Free will and consciousness are logically necessary for each other. You cannot have consciousness without a free will. Because then if you don't have free will, then that consciousness doesn't do anything. You see, it does. There's nothing it can do. It has no choices to make. It just is and persists as it is, unless, of course, it's following a script. But then that backs you up to who wrote the script, and where did the script come from? You see, so that doesn't help you to get to an answer. So anyway, free will is required for consciousness. And consciousness is necessary for free will. Because if you don't have consciousness, then what's free will? What's free choice if there's no awareness, no consciousness to make the choice? So those two things just aren't viable concepts unless they come together. So we as consciousness have free will. Now our bodies are part of a rule set. They're generated by a computer. Okay, so we might think that our bodies are deterministic, even though our consciousness has free will. And that's basically true, I guess, except that they're not really deterministic in the classical sense of that word, because it's probability and statistics, you see. And anything that is probable isn't really deterministic because there's random components involved, and anything that with random components cannot be deterministic. So it's got a deterministic root, which is the rule set, but the actual reality we live in is probability based. So it's not deterministic either. But now where do these statistical distributions come from that drive the probability? Well, they come from the rule set. And the rule set, like any rule set, it just follows the rules. It is sort of deterministic. But even part of the rule set can be a random number generator, can be part of the rule set. And you don't need pure randomness. All you need is apparent randomness. So the randomness that you can generate from a computer,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
is not truly random, that's all you need. All you need is something that creates things that are unexpected to
Yeah,
the actors.
yeah.
You know, it doesn't matter whether they are expected to the computer, it's whether or not they're expected to the actors, to the consciousness and the avatars that are being generated in the simulation.
Yeah.
All right, so we've covered all of that. Avatars.
What
Let me talk
determines?
about. Go
Okay,
ahead.
I was about to ask about decision space. What determines our
Okay.
decision space?
Okay. Let me lead up to that.
Alright.
We have pretty well said that we're talking about evolution with consciousness, and that means becoming love. Okay. Well, that means we, as individuated units of consciousness, have purpose. Okay, and our purpose is to evolve our consciousness, and I call that evolving the quality of our consciousness, improving the quality, which means lowering its entropy, creating content. Okay, now how do we do that? Well, here we are playing in this virtual reality game, and with our consciousness and our avatar, and what are we doing? We're making choices. We're making choices. That's our thing. That's what consciousness does. It makes choices, and as it makes those choices either are on the side of love or they're on the side of fear.
Yeah.
Those choices either contribute to lower entropy or they contribute to higher entropy. You see, on the whole, the choices will go one way or the other. So here we are, we make choices, and because of the choices we make, because of the quality of those choices and the intent behind those choices, we either evolve or de-evolve. Well, if you look at choices, you don't have to have infinite numbers of choices. All you need is some choices. Okay, so the choices you have at any moment, the choices that you know about, define your decision space. Your decision space is basically a set of all those choices that you can make. Now, there may be other choices you could make if you knew about them, but you're not aware of them, therefore they're not included in your decision space. Your decision space is only the choices that you can make. And that decision space then is what you work with, and it's the choices you make. When you decide to do this or do that or whatever, these are all choices you have within your decision space. Now, as you grow the quality of your consciousness, as you evolve, you have a bigger view on things. You have a bigger understanding, a bigger picture. The bigger your picture, the larger your decision space. You see? So decision space becomes part of the definition of consciousness because consciousness has free will to make a choice, to do something. Okay? So a consciousness is basically a thing that makes choices. It makes choices because it can make choices because it's aware. But it has a limited number of choices that it can make, which is defined by its decision space. And as it grows and gets a bigger picture, its decision space grows and gets more choices that it can make. So that's, those are, I guess, all the terms. I think I've hit all the terms now that you said. And that puts them in a context so you can see how they all relate to each other. Now, what I've just told your listeners is a real fast, over-the-top thumbnail sketch of concepts that, we could talk about this in more detail for the next 2 or 3 days and still not cover everything. So if you have problems with what you've just heard and you have pieces of this that don't make sense, that just, where does that come from? Then all of that is available in other videos and in the books. So it actually is logical, even though this little skip across the top, just defining words, may hit a lot of people as not making sense or being illogical, but there is good rationale behind all of it. So go to these other sources if you want to get more of the context.
In many of your MBT lectures and YouTube videos, you discuss the current problems facing the scientific community's search for a grand unified theory of everything. In your opinion, the string theory, the theory of holographic universe, the many worlds interpretation, and other scientific models of reality are only little toes, not the big toe. You argue that virtual reality is a lot better model of reality than the current scientific models of reality, and it explains many of the unanswerable questions that the present little picture scientific view of reality cannot explain. You say that science evolves by becoming aware of bigger pictures. The fact that we are living in a computer simulation and everything is just information is gaining more and more credibility in the scientific community. You argue that the next big paradigm shift in our scientific view of reality is going to be that we are virtual characters living in a computer simulation. And the second is that consciousness is the computer. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, and I have talked about that.
Yeah,
Why
yeah.
you skipped that, but there was one thing that I didn't talk about that I'd like to add here
Yeah.
is that things like string theory, theory of a holographic universe, and many worlds interpretation, they all have one thing in common, and that is they all are entirely physical virtual reality theories. In other words, everything is physical.
Yeah.
They start with the physical premises that our physical reality is all the reality there is. So then they try to create these interpretations. String theory particularly has a problem because it has so many dimensions. Each dimension is an assumption.
Yeah, yeah.
And there's no real what can we say? There's no real logic behind the assumption other than we need it.
Yeah.
We need that assumption in order to explain, these kinds of phenomena. So just because you need it, you stick it in there, and then you get something that works. Well, that didn't quite work. We need another one to prop up something. We get another one. Well, you do this 10, there's different dimensions, different numbers of these in string theory, but 10, 14, some of them are even higher than that.
Yeah.
If you take enough assumptions, you can make almost any theory work. If you're allowed 14 assumptions, you can start with anything and pretty much make it work. If your assumptions are just, I don't have to justify that other than I need it to make my theory work. Well, that's not a good way to build a scientific theory, is by making stuff up so that it answers the questions. Now, it's not quite as bad as that, but it is not that it's useless. It has some value to it. It's just that it's not fundamental.
Yeah.
It's not really fundamental. A holographic universe is all the information is on a two-dimensional surface, at the outline of a black hole or something. Well, that's, again, all physical. Everything's physical. And when it's everything physical, it always has a, well, how did that happen? Kind of problem to it. There's no way to really logically and rationally explain exactly why it is that way. It's like, well, let's assume that it's that way, then here's how it could work. But how it got to be that way is a miracle. It's one of those things. And they use the word holographic, I think, more as a metaphor than as a reality. A holograph is something that you shine light through to reproduce an image in light. That's a holograph. This is not what they're talking about. They're not saying that our reality, that somebody's shining a light through this two-dimensional surface, and we are all light images, whatever. They're not saying it that way. So it's not really a holographic universe. The holograph is just a metaphor, because there's a couple of properties of holographs, like all the information's contained in every part of the surface. See, that's the way a holograph is. If you make a holograph, you have you get an interference pattern basically that you capture on film, and if you send light back through the film from that interference pattern, it will reestablish your image. Okay, but if you cut that holographic film in half, you still get your image. It's only half as bright. And then if you just cut a little piece out of that, you still get your image. It's just it's not nearly as bright. So all the information is contained everywhere. Well, that's really an idea that seems to work well. So they took this idea and said, well, let's just call this holographic because it kind of has that property, and it's really a metaphor, and it's not really a holograph. So that whole thing is kind of bogus. The thing they missed is there's another thing that has that same property where all the information is contained in a tiny part. That's a fractal. Fractals are made from very simple things that keep being repeated over and over and over at different scales and so on, and they make these very complex things. So if we look at the fractal, too bad they didn't think about fractals when they were coming up with this metaphor, because if they'd caught at the theory of the fractal universe, I would have been much happier with the idea. But it's because the universe is actually fractal. Consciousness is a fractal system. And our virtual reality is based on fractals because they're process fractals, though, not geometric fractals. It's because the fundamental thing, the fundamental unit there is just evolution. You start with it. You start with this function of evolution. Okay, that's a process, and evolution is a process where you put in an input and it gives you a different output. It evolves. Then you take that output, put it back in the input, which runs through the same process. It evolves. So you have a process called evolution that works upon itself. It produces a fractal, which is a process fractal, which then creates this consciousness system. That's that's how our reality is. So in that way, that would be a decent thing. But the holographic universe they're trying to be too holographic by having all the information on a two-dimensional surface. They're trying to act like a hologram, but it just breaks down. We're not shining light through it. It's really not a hologram. That's not what's going on here. So I think it's just like, nice try, guys, but it doesn't quite hold together. The many worlds interpretation, that is a viable possibility, but it is horrendously inefficient. What it says is that every time a choice is made, that any being, any critter, any plant, any atom makes a choice, in other words, does something, that splits off another entire universe. You see? So if, I scratch my head with my right hand instead of my left hand, a whole universe has to get split off for that. An electron flips a spin up to a spin down. Oh, we need another universe. Well, there's a lot of electrons spinning and a lot of people scratching their head. And, if you go to a universe for every choice, that's just silly. That doesn't, it's not impossible, theoretically, you see. But it just doesn't make any sense. It's ridiculous as far as what it requires from the engine of reality, and it again, like all of these things, you have to assume, well, there's some engine of reality out there that just exists and spits off all these universes, and we have now trillions of quadrillions of parallel universes because of every choice that anybody and anything has ever made. See? Well, all right, we just start with something that spins off quadrillions of total universes, right? With all of the trillions of suns we have, and everything else, the whole universes have to go at a clip. Well, theoretically, we can solve a problem that way. It just doesn't make any sense. It's just I hate to say it's just a dumb idea, but it's not an idea that has logic behind it. It's an illogical idea. This reality is a probabilistic reality. It's not a deterministic reality. And the reason they make a many worlds is because they're trying very, very hard to maintain a deterministic view of reality. And if you need a deterministic view of reality, then the only thing you can do is either say that there is no possibility of change, everything always stays the same, or if it changes, we split off all these various universes that keep track of all the possible change. Then it's a stretch into fantasy in order to maintain a deterministic worldview. You
Yeah.
see,
Yeah.
as all of them do. The holographic universe retains a deterministic worldview. It's all a machine. It all just
Yeah.
calculates.
Yeah.
And that's the problem with these things. They're all, as you say, little toes
Yeah.
because they don't consider anything but the physical. They don't understand that the physical is information, that it's a virtual reality, and they ignore consciousness. They ignore everything that has more variability, more, what's the word, uncertainty, that doesn't fall into the objective world. You know,
Yeah.
all the subjective world. See, subjective world's the world of consciousness, right? It's the world of
Yeah.
thought. It's the world of idea. It's the world of concept. And all of that is gone. That doesn't have any basis in reality whatsoever. It doesn't actually exist, you see. So they're little toes, and they are stretching a few ideas to try to fit this bigger theory that they know there's this bigger theory, this bigger idea, and they're trying to
Yeah.
describe it from a little tiny subset. That's the problem with those other their models. They're too small and they just don't work. They're not logical, and or they're too complicated with all of their assumptions.
Yeah.
That is the problem. Whereas the virtual reality and the larger conscious system, I can start that from the very beginning, and for the very beginning of the larger consciousness system, and follow it through logically, and it doesn't require infinite anything. You know, it doesn't require billions of universes. It doesn't require all of this computation and so on. It's a much more reasonable theory that will produce all the same results that these do, plus a whole lot more.
Yeah.
Because it then describes consciousness and theology and metaphysics and all sorts of things, and these are just trying to describe the physical world.
Yeah.
So they use things that are hard to rationalize or hard to you know, they're hard to swallow.
Yeah.
They make big assumptions for their starting. Big assumptions, and like, you know, like what is spitting out all these universes? Wow, must be awfully big and powerful. You can just spit out, you know, billions of universes every microsecond. You know, wow, that's some machine. You know, well, we don't know. We won't go there. We just say that machine exists. You see, well, that's a pretty, you know, that's right up there with the flying spaghetti monster exists. You know, you're making an assumption that really is just out of the clear blue, and the holographic universe. You know, well, it's not really holographic. Oh, well, what is it? Well, we don't know. Well, if you don't know, it's not a very good theory. You know, string theory. Well, this didn't work, so let's make up another assumption to make it work. That's not very good either. You need something. I guess Einstein said that basically you're looking for a theory that is elegant, that has the fewest number of assumptions that you need in order to make it work.
Yes.
So, you know, mine has basically two fundamental assumptions, and everything else then is logically derived from those two. And it doesn't start, and none of those two are particularly wow. You know, it's not like there's this big machine that makes billions of universes every millisecond. You know, it's not that kind of a wild assumption. It's basically that consciousness exists, evolution exists.
Yeah.
That's all you need. From those two concepts, you can derive everything else. So that's why these other toes, which are little toes, just trying to describe the physical universe, kind of fall flat and just aren't all that interesting. They're trying to do a little job, and even then they're not doing it very, very well, at least in my estimation.
Yeah. Tom, I'd like to talk a little bit about the being level and the intellectual level that you talk about. And you emphasize that there are two levels of human existence, the being level and the intellectual level. And you also say that on the deepest level, the my big toe can be understood only on the being level, which is the truest level of human existence, but not on the intellectual level, which is usually being driven by our fear and our ego. And also in your My Big Toe trilogy, you say that our intellect cannot by itself either love or lower entropy, nor direct intent or will, and that change in our consciousness can only happen on the being level and not on the intellectual level. Can you talk more about the difference between the being level and the intellectual level, and also about how we can access this being level?
Okay. Fundamentally, consciousness functions on two levels. Now, I say that because that's the way most of us are. So when I'm talking to, 100 people out there, then probably all 100 of them, that's true. I'm talking to 100,000 people out there, there may be a few that that's not true for. So this is not a fundamental statement that consciousness always has to function on two levels. It's that consciousness in us, we humans, and on most other critters, does function on two levels. So it's part of us. Now, what defines these two levels, or what separates the two? Well, let me not get that detailed yet. So we'll start with that. It goes on two levels. Now, typically, these two levels are separated by intuition and feelings on the being level, and also the subconscious is at that being level as well. And then we have intellect and ego and beliefs that are in the intellectual level. So that's just kind of generally the way that is. Okay. Now, you made the statement that that my big toe can only be understood on the being level.
On the deepest level.
At the being level, but not on the intellectual level. Well, that's not entirely true. It's not exactly like that. What I say is that one can only evolve the quality of their consciousness by making changes. That is, the changes are getting rid of fear and becoming love. That's the change. That only is significant at the being level. Okay, that's really what I mean. Okay. Also, let's see.
How can we access this being level? How do?
Okay. Well, let me talk a little more about it and define it. The typical human is high entropy. Okay. The typical human is a high entropy being. So, as I've described above in the talk, our virtual reality is like a schoolhouse. It's like a place that we individuated units of consciousness come in order to grow up, in order to evolve and raise the quality of our consciousness, to lower our entropy. Okay, so the typical human is a pretty high entropy organism. This is not a graduate school or a college. This is like first grade, This is kindergarten. We are here, we have lots of fear and lots of ego, and we're here to make choices, and by those choices, evolve the quality of our consciousness. So the typical human is a high entropy being driven by fear, ego, and belief. Okay, to deal with that fear, which means to keep it under control because it gets in the way. Obviously, if you're always in a state of panic, it's very hard to get anything done, right? It's hard to make rational choices. So in order to keep that fear under control, the intellectual level finds a way to push the fear out of the intellect, which means out of the mind. So you stop dealing with it. You stop considering it. You take that fear and you stuff it down under the rug where it doesn't bother you so much, because then you can go on making the choices and decisions. You kind of go on with your life. You're not paralyzed by the fear. But the result is that the intellectual level and the being level then become separated. See? Okay. The subconscious then is born. That's why we have a subconscious. Okay. A low entropy individuated unit of consciousness is aware at all levels. A low entropy consciousness doesn't have a subconscious.
Yeah.
It's aware of everything going on. It's aware of its instincts. It's aware of its feelings. It's aware of all of that stuff. And it's all within context. They're all integrated. So the being level can think and analyze. Okay, the being level can do all these things.
Yeah.
We start out as a full, well, I could say fully developed consciousness with just consciousness. We don't break it into levels, okay? But then because of our fear and our having to push that fear down to get it out of the way, now we start, that's where the two levels come from. So when I talk about consciousness operates on two levels, I say that like that's just a fact because for almost all of us, that's just a fact. That's the way it is. We have enough fear and enough ego and enough beliefs that our consciousness works on two levels. We do have a subconscious, and we have this intellectual level, which is the way we think things are, the way we think we are, and then we have a being level, which is how we really are at our core level of being. You know, that's who we really are. So we don't really, most of us don't really know who we really are inside. All we know is who we think we are. And a lot of that has to do with our images, you know, what we think about ourselves. We often keep a lot of little white lies about ourselves and the way we think that we are and how wonderful we are and all the good things we do, et cetera, et cetera. You know, so we see ourselves not as we are, but as we would like ourselves to be, or as we think we are. And that can go in the negative too. We can think we're more awful and more horrible than we really are too. But it's all thinking. That's what I mean by the intellectual level. The being level is really what's inside. That's the core of the being. And it's confusing when I talk about that because people tend to think that this intellectual level and being levels are just two fixed levels. And that you can't think at the being level and you can't feel at the intellectual level and they're just separate. That's not the true. An individual at the being level can think, can feel, and be aware of everything. It's just that most of us aren't like that. Most of us do have a subconscious where stuff goes on that we don't think about. It's not in our intellect. It's part of our emotions. It's part of our feeling. It's part of our fear. It's part of our instincts. It's all that stuff that is not in our intellect, and we define ourselves as our intellect. So most people say, well, who are you? Well, that means, what are you thinking? You know, who are you at the thought level? Because outside of your intellectual level is beyond your intellect. You don't know. You don't go there, you see? So it seems like just a completely different space that's out of control, but that's just because we have the fear. If we didn't have the fear, it wouldn't be that way. Okay, so how do we contact? How do we get in touch with this? Well, we all have a being level because here we are. We be. That's the root of our consciousness and where we exist. How can we actually build that up so that more of our awareness is expressed at the being level? That's called being authentic, right? When we talk about you need to express yourself authentically. That basically means living from the being level rather than living out of the intellectual level. The intellectual level plays all sorts of games, but the being level just is. It just is this. So how do we become more authentic? We have to get rid of our fear and ego. It's our fear and ego that makes us not authentic, you see? So the answer is by getting rid of fear and ego. That's how we get connected to our being level. And how do we do that? Well, the only way to do that is, one, you have to really want to. Because if you don't really want to, you won't. You know, it's like the alcoholic. An alcoholic says, see, this alcoholism really makes my life terrible. It's ruining my relationships. I'm not doing well at work. I really need to stop this. And if they really mean that, they'll stop it. If that's something really fundamental, if they are the one talking, but if it's their addiction talking, then the addiction says, well, yeah, that's right. We will stop this, but let's have a little drink first. See? Just one little sip. That's all, no more than that. And they basically, the intellect talks their way into doing what feels good. You see? So what you have to realize is that the fear and ego that you have is what creates your problem.
Yeah.
And that's what you're addicted to, if you will. That's the way you live your life.
Mm-hmm.
And anything that happens, any thought that you have that's negative, any thought that you have that is, stressful, that
Yeah.
is unhappy, that makes you angry, that gets you uptight, that is
Yeah.
unfair, all those unhappy, miserable thoughts, they're all driven by your fear.
Mm.
Okay, now ego is not separate from fear. Ego is created by fear.
Yeah.
So fear makes the ego.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ego is an awareness in service of fear.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Mm-hmm.
what ego is. It's
Yeah.
your awareness in service of your fear.
Yeah.
Okay, so all of these things that make us unhappy and that are negative and downers,
Mm-hmm.
they're all connected to fear. So when you
Yeah.
feel one of those things, something makes you angry, something makes you
Mm.
uptight, something makes you upset, well, that is attached, no doubt, to your ego.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, why? Go back and say, why am I upset? What is it upsetting about this?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, you'll get the first excuse, which is like, oh, well, they did that to me and that's unfair. You say, well,
Yeah.
why does that upset me? Okay, they did that and that was unfair. Why does that upset me? Oh,
Mm-hmm.
because everything needs to be fair for me because it's all about me. You see, I'm the one that's really important. And if it's not fair to me, well, that's a
Yeah.
big deal. So because you see yourself as the center of the universe, then
Mm-hmm.
fairness to you is extremely important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, now that's getting back to fear. Remember, fear is all about self.
Yeah.
Love is all about other.
Yeah.
So if you take all those negative feelings and you try to first find the ego, which isn't that hard to find, there
Mm-hmm.
we are. Oh, I see. It's because it's all about me. It's
Mm-hmm.
me. That's why. Now, why do I feel that way? Why
Mm-hmm.
is it that it's so important that I get what I want and that other
Mm-hmm.
people see things the way I see it? Why is that so important? Then you can find the fear.
Mm-hmm.
It's the fear of not being competent. It's the fear of, it's the insecurity. It's the not
Yeah.
being lovable, not being taken seriously. It's all these fears that we have that makes it so important that people recognize us and do things and, that we have it the way we want it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's the fear that we won't get what we want.
Mm-hmm.
And once you see that, you realize, oh, there's a fear.
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
need to get rid of that.
Yeah.
And you focus on it. And when that comes up next time, you go, oh, no, I'm not going there. I'm
Yeah.
not going to let that stress me. I'm not going to get upset because so-and-so did something and it's unfair. That's just life. I'll just accept that and go on.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard, but
Mm-hmm.
it's only hard in the beginning. The
Yeah.
hardest step is the first step you take. And that is really committing yourself to doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, just it's like you have to stay with it every minute of every day to watch why you do. What's your intent? Why are you doing? Why are you feeling the way you do? Find the ego that'll lead you to the fear and then make a conscious effort to get rid of the fear.
Yeah.
So that's like that alcoholic we were using as an example.
Mm-hmm.
When he convinces, oh, well, I'll just take one little drink, and he finds his hand going up around that bottle, he says, no, not
Yeah.
going to do that.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
isn't right. I'm not going to do that. And
Yeah.
he puts the bottle back
Yeah.
on the shelf.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it's not easy for an alcoholic to do that. That's a hard thing to do. Okay. Well, it's not easy for somebody to put their fear away and to deal with things without the fear.
Yeah.
We believe we need that fear. Otherwise, we'd be so insecure and so unable to deal with life because all that fear would be there.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how you deal with it. You find it, and then you just, through your will of wanting to get rid of it, slowly you will succeed. And at first, it's like, oh, I just can't get rid of it. I keep trying, but every time I still get angry. I still do these things. But that's all right. It takes time. You're not talking about something that needs to happen in a week or a month or even a year. You're talking about an exercise that is probably the most important thing you can do for all the rest of your life. So you just do it every day, work on it. And then if you get by that first hurdle or two to where you actually see some progress, and now things don't make you angry anymore. The stuff that used to make you angry just doesn't make you angry anymore. You become a happier person. There's more joy in your life. Everything is working better. And because you are better, everybody likes you better, everybody connects to you better, and a lot of that unfair stuff just stops happening. You see, it all
Yeah.
feeds on itself to where it gets easier and easier and easier the further you go.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hard to do. It just takes a lot of you have to decide that you're really going to do it, and then you
Yeah.
just have to tough it out and stick with it until you get rid of that fear. And as you get rid of that fear, you become more and more connected to your being level. You become a more authentic person. You start to react and interact just out of the core of who you are, rather than out of the fear and all the manipulated image and all the rest of that stuff. And you actually get to find out who you are. You get acquainted with yourself, and then that makes it even easier. So you see, that's how you get acquainted with the being level. It's not an easy process, but as far as I know, it's the only process that there is. So the only antidote to fear is courage. It takes courage to do that. It takes courage for that alcoholic to let that bottle go, because now that means he's going to have to deal with all those miserable things in his life that he's escaping by drinking the liquid out of that bottle. That's why he's drinking it, to escape all his demons and all of his fears and all of his inadequacies and all of the hurt and all of the shame. And that's why he's drinking, to get rid of all that stuff. And now he's going to have to face it and deal with it and get over it. And that takes courage. And the individual, it takes courage to do it, and it takes a lot of dedication to doing that. So that's how you do that. Let's see, have we gotten all that question?
Yeah.
I think so.
You also talked about that our purpose is here to evolve and grow up towards love. Then how can we do that then?
Well, that is the same. You do that in exactly the same way. You see, you get rid of the fear, because if you don't have the fear, you are love. See, we just have these two different things, and in as much as you have a lot of fear, then you don't have as much capacity for love. As you get rid of that fear, then if you start not doing things with the intent of feeding the self, if you do them with cooperation and caring about other, then that's love. So if you get rid of the fear, you will become love. So it's the same thing. How do you become love? How do we evolve? You get rid of the fear. It's the fear that creates the ego and the belief that prevents you from becoming love. So if you get rid of the fear and the ego and belief, you just will become love. That will be it's a natural process. See, that's what you're here to do. It's like it'll feel completely natural to you. It just will start working for you. So that's how you become love. The same way, getting rid of fear is you become love and become connected to your being level.
All right. Tom, I'd like to talk with you about nonviolent communication, democratic education, and monetary reform. And is it okay we start with nonviolent communication?
Sure. We can talk about these issues. These are all kind of big issues out there in the intellectual space. Things to talk about.
Are you familiar with nonviolent communication, one of the most effective methods and approaches to communicating, speaking and listening that has improved the quality of relationships of hundreds of thousands of people around the world, developed by Marshall Rosenberg in the beginning of 1960s. Nonviolent communication functions often as a conflict resolution process. It's based on the principles of nonviolence, the natural state of compassion where no violence is present in our heart. People who practice nonviolent communication have been able to improve their communication with others, increase understanding, deepen connection, and resolve conflicts. Do you think that if nonviolent communication and similar communication methods, like the Garden model developed by Thomas Garden, become more known around the world, it can create an environment in which it will be easier for us to grow up towards love and grow the quality of our consciousness compared to our present environment?
Well, the answer just to that last question would be yes. I
Mm-hmm.
think it. I think it will.
Yeah, yeah.
But let's talk a little bit about it.
Mm-hmm.
That
Mm-hmm.
NVC, the
Yeah.
nonviolent communication, it is at its very best a methodology aimed at reducing fear and ego.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Adding love, caring,
Yeah.
consideration, compassion to human
Mm-hmm.
communications. Okay, and at the very worst, it's only acting that way.
Mm-hmm.
You see, in other words, people can learn the skill of
Mm-hmm.
nonviolent communication to where
Yeah.
they can act that way in a
Mm-hmm.
role, maybe as mediator or some sort of thing,
Mm-hmm.
or with people, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they've got it at the being level.
Mm-hmm.
It means
Mm-hmm.
they've got it at the intellectual level, and they may
Yeah.
be saying the right words and not necessarily lowering, their entropy any,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but they are making their behavior a lot more civilized.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You see? So there's a difference there. Again, we have an intellectual level, being
Mm-hmm.
level thing.
Mm-hmm.
So the nonviolent communication is good
Mm-hmm.
at either level.
Yeah, yeah.
If it's at the intellectual level, it's civilizing.
Yeah.
Now, instead of being grouchy and fussing and calling names and doing all that stuff, you listen, and you
Mm-hmm.
provide these other skills. But it's even better yet if it's at the being level and you do this just because that's the way you are, because there is no anger. And you
Yeah.
do want to listen because you care about other. You see,
Mm-hmm.
there's a difference.
Yeah.
Now, the either one, of
Mm-hmm.
course, is good.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
the one where you actually become, more caring of other
Mm.
and less hostile, that's obviously the better way to go. But that's not something you can learn. You
Yeah,
can't
yeah.
learn how to be. You can go and learn how to act.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if you want to and you care about growing up, then you can take that acting and convert it more easily into being,
Mm-hmm.
because it's something you want to be rather than just something you use to manipulate the argument to be
Yeah.
more
Yeah.
uh, more cooperative.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's a good
Mm-hmm.
thing because it's doing just what we're talking about. It's
Yeah.
taking the fear and ego out of the
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that's good.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's good.
Yeah. The proponents of democratic education criticize the modern educational system in which the children don't have anything to say about how, when, what, where, and with whom they learn, and don't have an equal share in the decision making as to how their schools are run. Proponents of democratic education claim that most of the schools in the world don't uphold such values as justice, respect, and trust for children. They also claim that because the schools are not democratic in nature, they are not suited for preparing children for a democratic society. A fundamental premise of democratic education is that curiosity is innate and that children want to learn naturally. Children that attend democratic schools say that they enjoy the freedom they are given to choose what to do with their time, the control that they have on their own learning, and the fact that they can pursue freely whatever interest that they have. How do you think we should change the educational system, and what do you think about the future of education?
Okay. Your first question is is about changing. How do you think we should change the educational system? And I
Mm.
will say, I think absolutely, exclamation mark, it needs to be changed. Our
Yeah, yeah.
education system is terrible from beginning to end.
Yeah.
Now, as a democratic education, not so much
Mhm.
because of the word children. Now, if
Mhm.
this were adult education that you were talking about,
Yeah.
I'd say absolutely. This
Yeah.
democratic, absolutely.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
children aren't don't have enough experience, aren't
Mm.
really wise enough or knowledgeable enough, or even have the concepts,
Mhm.
much less the ability to express the concepts,
Mhm.
um, to be the decision makers
Yeah.
in their education.
Mhm.
We have to take care of children. You know, we don't say, okay, children, go out and play. You can play in the street, you know, you can play in your yard, you know, you can get on a bus and go somewhere, do whatever you want. We
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
tell that to our children. We say, children, stay in the yard, do not go into the street. It's dangerous. Why? Because they really don't have enough of a big picture about what reality and what their environment is like,
Yeah.
not to walk out in the street in front of a car. They just don't know. So we have to take special care of our children, make decisions for them that are good for them, whether they like it or not. No, you cannot have candy for dinner. You're going to have to eat something more nourishing, because if you have candy for dinner, it won't be healthy. You won't be healthy. You need to be healthy. Even though you want to eat candy for dinner, daddy and mommy say no. You see, so children, I don't think this idea of letting the children, make decisions about how the schools run, give them the equal voice in making decisions. Let's see, you know, choose what they want to do with their time, control, you know, what they have, you know,
What about when
on
they're
their
a little bit
own.
older? A little
Huh?
bit older,
Yeah.
when they become a little bit older, maybe 12, 13, still you wouldn't
Well,
give them
I
the.
think you give them more. Same with your children. When your children are 12, you do let them go out and walk on the sidewalks. You know, go ahead and walk to grandma's house. You know, she lives 6 blocks away. Be careful crossing the street. You know, look both ways. You teach them, and then you let them go. You still, at 12 years old, probably don't put them behind the wheel of a car and say, go take a 2-week vacation, have a nice time. You know, they're only 12 years old. So as they get old enough, definitely include them in the planning and in what you're doing and how you're going to do it, whatever.
Yeah.
But you have to understand where they are, their limitations, and an adult needs to take care of children up to the limit that they need to be taken care of. Now, as they get older, there's more input they can give. And when they get to be adults, they should have equal input, just as it says, in everything, you know, they do. Because now they're adults, they can make decisions, and then they have to live by the consequences of those decisions. If they're adults and they want to eat candy for dinner, let them eat candy for dinner. They will
Yeah.
have to deal with the consequences. But we don't do that to children. We don't say, children, yeah, do whatever you want and deal with the consequences, because that wouldn't be nice to the children.
Yeah.
So I'd say that if this was adult education, absolutely. For children, depends on how much freedom and how much you involve them in it. Just depends on how much of that they are able to do, you know, with some wisdom, such that it's good for them.
Yeah.
You know, I can see a whole bunch of little boys, particularly, wouldn't do anything but play video games, you
Yeah.
know, for 5 or 6 or 7 years before they do anything else. Well, that may not be terrible, but it kind of depends on the video games they're playing. You know, it might not help. We might
Yeah.
find out that later on that's not really doing them much of a service. To do that, it makes them non-competitive in the culture for the things that they're one day are going to have to do, like pay the rent, you know,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
you know, buy a car. You know, there's things they're going to have to do, and they won't be able to do that in the
Yeah.
societies.
But
So
people who have graduated from democratic schools have been just as successful than people normal schools. They have been more successful people that have been, been to democratic schools like Summerhill and
I
Sudbury.
would agree with that, but I would say that if you look at those democratic schools, you will find that they're not democratic to the degree that you say here. Somebody is making a curriculum. Somebody is saying, okay, children, you have choices. Here are 10 things that you can choose. But breaking the windows in the school is not on the list. Okay, if what
Yeah.
you want to do is throw your desk through the windows or something like that, no, that's not a choice. You do not get to do all the things you want. Here's a list of approved choices. You can read, you can play with the Tinker Toys, you can do da 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 da. These are appropriate for your age, and you get to choose. That's not democratic. That's not saying, children, what do you want to do today? Oh, I want to throw rocks through the windows. Okay, you go do that. We'll put new windows in tomorrow.
Yeah.
So in
Yeah.
case you want to do it tomorrow, we'll have some windows for you to throw rocks through.
Yeah.
So no, it's not really democratic. What they've done in these schools that are called democratic is that they've given the children choices that are appropriate for them and guidance as they do these things. And there needs to be, you probably also can't have a democratic education if you have 50 children in one classroom. Probably doesn't work, because as they do things on their own, they need guidance. They need people pointing out things. Otherwise, their learning is slow. You can learn strictly from trial and error, and you need some trial and error in learning. But if that's the only way you learn, that's a slow route, rather than having somebody along the way give you a little guidance and point out, okay, see this maze? You've tried now for 3 days to get through this maze. Let me give you a hint, you know, because otherwise you get frustration, and then you get frustration, you get refusal, you know, you get denial. I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. And it isn't fun. All it does is frustrate me, you see? So a little help at the right time is very important. So I would say that these democratic schools you're talking about are really structured. They're not entirely democratic. They don't let the kids do whatever they want. They are constructed in a way that probably lets the kids make decisions up to the level that they're capable of making them.
Are they good
Which is
schools?
a whole lot more freedom than a public school, which doesn't make them make any decisions at all.
They're better schools, in your opinion, than public schools.
Yeah, well, I homeschooled my kids, so that's what I thought of the public school system. You know, I retired my job at 50 and homeschooled my kids, and I homeschooled my youngest. Then I homeschooled her from 6th or 7th grade all the way through, through high school. Until she went off and went to college. And my other ones, my son was like in 7th or 8th grade, and my daughter was like 8th, 9th grade. So I took those 3 of them. At that point, as they went through elementary school, it was just bad. By the time they got into middle school, it was so bad that they couldn't stand it, and I couldn't stand it. So we did something. We did something else. I did the homeschooling. So yes, I think our educational system is horrible. I think giving kids the ability to interact and make choices within their system is wonderful. I think giving children, it would be wonderful if you could give the children maybe not as much as one-on-one with an adult, but say an adult with 3 or 4. That would be probably about perfect. But when you have one adult and they've got 30 to 50 children, there's not a lot of teaching going to be going on. There's not a lot of learning that's going to be going on, you see. So schools that have a much higher teacher to student, and that the teachers are much better educated, a lot of the teachers in the public schools wouldn't do well in any kind of school, just not good at teaching. They just don't understand their own reality well enough that they can really help children. All they can do is learn to regurgitate this. Learn to regurgitate that. They can walk down a lesson plan and tell the children, what to learn and what not to learn, but shoot, you don't need a teacher for that. A computer could do that better than most teachers. The teacher needs to say things that are encouraging, that are inspiring, that, that kind of thing. Computers are hard, have a hard time doing those kinds of things. Computers have a hard time inspiring children, but they can give lesson plans and do, give a lot of instruction. Anyhow, yes, the educational system is awful. But now, what do I think about the future of education, which in our country, and probably a lot of Western countries, when you talk about education, you're talking about public education for the most part. That's what most kids go through. They go through a public education. And I would assert that the public education is the way it is because we are the way we are. It reflects us. Okay, here we are, we're full of fear, and because we're full of fear and ego, we want to control, we want to demand, we want it to be our way. We don't want these kids to be a nuisance. We want them to sit down and shut up and listen to what we tell them. And well, that's us. That's the way we are. So our schools are the way they are because we humanity are the way we are. And it reflects us. As we grow up and change, our schools will grow up and change
Yeah.
too. So it, if you try to force a change,
Mhm.
if you try to force a change, like you just say, okay, I'm the new commissar of education and I'm just going to change everything.
Yeah.
Tomorrow, it's going to be this way.
Mhm.
And you just change everything. It
Mhm.
probably wouldn't work very
Mhm.
well.
Mhm.
And eventually, after you went away,
Mhm.
whether it means until after you die or
Mhm.
whatever, after the commissar leaves, it'll
Yeah.
go right back to the way it was.
Mhm.
Why? Because that expresses the way we the people are.
Mhm.
And that's
Yeah.
what we're comfortable with. And that's what we're going to do. So
Yeah.
even if you could force a change, it would only be temporary. And it probably would be a nightmare trying to get it implemented because implementing it wouldn't seem natural.
Yeah. Yeah.
Implementing wouldn't seem right. You
Mhm.
tell this teacher's been teaching for 20 years and you say, okay, within these range of things, your children would like to, be able to pick and choose what they do and how they do it. So
Mhm.
you may have 20 children and all of them
Mhm.
may be working something different. And you need to
Mhm.
stay up with that and make sure you're right there when they have questions, you see? And the teacher will say, I can't do that.
Yeah.
It's impossible.
Mhm.
Okay, you hire a whole bunch more teachers and you do that. And now they have conflicts with who's in charge. And one of them wants to do this way, the other wants to do that way. And they're
Mhm.
fighting with each other. Why? Because they have a lot of fear and egos. And what they do
Mhm.
is fight. What
Yeah.
they do is complain. What they do is find problems with other people because it's not about them and so on,
Mhm.
you see? So it's just, and same with the children. It's not like
Mhm.
the children are all full of love
Mhm.
and joy either. You see, the children live in homes and families and in a culture that's full of
Mhm.
fear and whatever, and they
Yeah.
pick that same stuff up. They see it's all about them as well and not
Yeah.
about other people. So
Mhm.
you're going to have all of these problems that
Mhm.
just won't work. The implementation, even if you had the theory down pat, the implementation would be
Mhm.
somewhere between impossible and
Mhm.
horrendous.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
just wouldn't seem to work.
Yeah.
So, and that's because we can't support it. We, the
Mhm.
people, have too much fear and ego to support that kind
Mhm.
of a system.
Yeah.
And when we change, it'll change. All
Yeah.
right, now that's a chicken and egg. Well, if you try to push on education to get better, well, that will probably help us get better
Mhm.
too,
Mhm. Mhm.
because there's a
Yeah.
lot of influence over children there. Let's try not to feed our children so much fear and
Mhm.
control and that kind of
Yeah.
stuff. Let's get them out of these fear, ego, control
Mhm.
environments.
Yeah.
Sure. So it's not like you can say, well, we'll just have to sit back and let it change itself when we're ready.
Yeah.
That's not the point either. The point is you can't force it to be something it isn't, but you need to keep the pressure up trying to help it grow into something better than it is.
Mhm. Yeah.
So, that's kind of my idea
Mhm.
about education.
Yeah.
I like to see education not only be more free and democratic, but I think
Mhm.
we have a mechanism to do that today
Mhm.
that we didn't have 20 years
Yeah.
ago.
Yeah.
It's called the internet.
Mhm. Yes.
It's
Exactly.
called computers.
Mhm.
It's called program learning.
Yeah.
We ought to be able to design a lot of individual, for various subjects and various pieces of subjects based on the child's interest. Now, here you
Mhm.
have a child who could choose one of 20 different program learning
Mhm.
courses to
Mhm.
take,
Yeah.
and it doesn't have to have 20 teachers to do it because each one's a different, subject or something. Let's take our programming and our software and our
Mhm.
communications nets and let's customize the education to the child to where they go through this program learning. They've got
Mhm.
problems, they get scored, have projects that are hands-on, to build
Mhm.
things and do stuff. And we could create a really interesting learning environment that wouldn't take, one teacher per child or even one teacher for two or three children. That could
Mhm.
be well designed to let children learn on their own as much as possible because they
Yeah.
learn better when they're
Mhm.
doing it on their own,
Yes.
and they won't do it unless they're also interested in having fun,
Mhm.
you
Yes.
see.
Exactly.
So we could do that. We
Yeah.
have the technology, as they as
Yeah.
they say. You see, we have the technology to do that. What we don't have is the will.
Yes.
Now,
Yes.
someplace will institute that on a small scale in some neighborhood, someplace, and it'll work really, really well, and it'll spread and so on. So, and I'm all in favor of that kind of thing happening.
Yeah.
But back in the early days of computing, back, I don't know, probably in the late 70s, early 80s, really I mean, they had computers then, but they were all mainframe kind of things. They didn't have personal computers back in that day. But anyway, they had there was a big push to do program learning then, which means you start with a program that teaches math or that teaches English or that does these things, and the children sits and the computer explains something to them. Then it gives them examples. Then it shows them, then it gives them some things to try on their own, and then it tells them what's wrong with what they did and shows them how the right way is to it. But it's doing it with fun. So if you're doing this with 6 years old, then it's not just words. It's a little clown comes up and sings a little song about how you got the right answer, the wrong answer. You're making it fun, age appropriate thing. And if you get a lot wrong, well, then you go back and it presents you stuff that's a little easier, a little simple, a little straightforward. You get a lot of that wrong, it goes back and gets you it takes you wherever you want to go. So you don't have to have everybody marching along together in a big group. You can have kids that are someplace from doing, third grade math and eighth grade social studies. It's okay. Let them work how they work. And then you have teachers that try to keep them, focused on some of the things they need as opposed to just the things that they enjoy. So there's going to be some structure. Sometimes the child has to be told, you do need to learn arithmetic. Even if that's not what you want to learn, you're going to have to learn that anyway. It will be useful. You're not going to be able to live your life successfully without it. So, okay, you can do most of this, but you're still going to have to do that because it's good for you. And I know that it is, and you don't, so obey. You're still going to have some of that going on. But it'll be done one-on-one, one child, one learning system. This isn't necessarily a person standing up lecturing. One learning system, and it can be at their own rate. Go back as far as they need to go to get the basics to where they can move on through it and make it fun, and don't overdo it. They're not going to sit in front of this computer for 8 hours, doing work. Children can't do that. They need breaks, they need games, they need other things to do. But we have the technology. So I'd say a revolution in education. It's all there. The possibilities are all right in front of us. All we have to do is have the will to do it. But we don't have the will to do it because the education system, just the way it is, serves the culture as it is. The culture needs a lot. The culture wants a lot of people who can't think critically, who will do what they're told, except. So we are manufacturing little cogs, for our machine, and it works. So because of that, we have to change a lot of attitudes. Attitudes toward life, attitudes toward children, attitudes toward education, and a lot of attitudes have to change before, before that'll work. Right now, we like little cogs for our wheel because they're easily manipulated. They're easily frightened. You can get them all to do whatever you want pretty easily because they just don't think much. They're not too critical. They've learned to obey, etc. So the whole culture has to change. So you're not going to change education until you change the culture. It is as it is, like I say, because we are as we are. And we value non-critical thinking, obedient cogs. And because we value that, that's what we produce. So it's a big thing. You have to look at these things kind of systemically. Not just to get in there and change education, get in there and change politics, get in there and change economics. It won't work. It's all part of a much bigger system. And if you don't change the whole thing together, the changes won't take. They'll just slough off.
Monetary reformers want a more just and sustainable monetary system that benefits the people instead of private banks. Monetary reformers advocate a monetary system in which the government issues debt-free money directly from the treasury and the banning of fractional reserve banking. Monetary reformers criticize the current monetary system in which most of our money is created as interest-bearing debt by private banks through fractional reserve banking. Monetary reformers also criticize politicians and economists who support the current monetary system, but often do not even understand the mechanism of money creation, a subject that the mainstream media also almost never covers. What do you think about the international movement for monetary reform that visions a more just, democratic, and sustainable monetary system in the world?
That's an easy question, just like the one on education, and it's going to come out very similar. I'd support that movement. Yes, good idea. But it's important to understand that this movement is working on symptom relief rather than on fixing the underlying problem, which is basically what we came up with education. I mean, it's good. Sure, we have problems in education. We need to change them. But if we just go in and change the symptom, it'll go right back. It won't stick because the society won't get it. They won't do it. So yes, monetary reform, it's obvious. It's a no-brainer. I mean, just look at it. You know, I mean, anybody with a brain can look at that and say this would be a big improvement. This idea that that the government, prints money, gives it to, private parties who then turn around and lend it to us. Well, the only people that are really benefited by that are the private parties that get to collect the interest. And that's why it was created, to shuffle money into their pockets. That's why it works that way. So, yes, it's a very good idea, but it's not likely to happen for a long time because the society isn't ready to make that change. We the people. Now, here's one where it benefits so few. And what do we say? What's the opposite of benefits? It penalizes so many. So here's one where if you could get the so many to understand how it penalizes them, there may be a lot of popular support for changing it, because it's not that it benefits the whole culture very much. It mainly just benefits a few people very much, and the whole culture is disadvantaged by it. So here's one that you have a chance for actually making a change at the root. But what you have to do is get the majority of the people in the culture to more than the majority. You need to get an overwhelming majority of the people, in the culture to demand that it be changed. Because if they don't demand it, it won't be done. If they just go, that's the way it is. That's the way it's always been. I can see it's not a good idea, but I can't do anything about it. That won't help. But if you had like 80% of your electorate up in arms about it, it would change. But if you only have 50% of your electorate up in arms, well, shoot, that's not such a big problem, because the people who are getting all that money, all that free money on the side, they can just buy laws, buy elections, buy attitudes. You buy attitudes through propaganda, right? Propaganda costs money, at least to distribute it on airwaves and TV waves and whatever. So, if it's not a really serious, widespread understanding, then it's going to go away, because the people that do benefit from this system can manipulate the attitudes of the people that get hurt by the system, so that they'll vote against their own self-interest just because they are susceptible to the propaganda, just because they went through a school system that taught them to sit down and be quiet and be a nice little cog in the machine and don't think critically. You see, so it's a problem. But with this one, I think, is one that you can do a lot more about than you can education. Because the people who are entrenched that are feeding off this are small in number compared to the people who are being hurt by it.
Yeah.
So there's some real hope here that this one might turn around without having to change the whole culture to get it to turn around. But still, you're going to have to do a massive thing. You're not going to change it, which means you just have to keep the pressure up. The people who are, this movement you talk about, the monetary reform movement, just has to keep educating.
Yeah.
Just has to keep talking. Just has to keep getting their ideas out there. And who knows? Eventually, we may get this landslide that says we need to change that, and it'll change.
Yeah.
It will change. But until we get that landslide, it's not going to change.
Yeah.
So that's just a matter of education.
Yeah. Yes.
And that's, good idea. It's just not likely to happen for a while. It's so entrenched into our system and the way things work. It's uprooting that and putting in something else would be traumatic for a while.
Yeah.
But it certainly could be done.
Yeah.
Certainly most of us would all be better off for it, at the end.
Yeah.
Some other system. But there's so much, an economic system is not like it's just a simple little thing. It's only got 4 parts, that move.
Yeah.
And it's an interconnected system that connects thousands of different variables are all connected and balanced in this system. Well, you get a whole system like that with all of those variables, everything balanced to create the more or less successful system we have. Could be a lot more, but it's balanced. It's kind of hard to tear that apart and build something else without creating some havoc in the process.
Yeah.
Now, eventually that havoc will, get fixed and come under control or whatever, but it is not a trivial thing to do. We shouldn't get the idea that, that's simple. We'll just change.
Yeah.
We'll just say, we're not going to do it like that anymore, and that's all there is to it.
Yeah.
It's a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah.
An economic system is a very complex bunch of compensating, connected things. And to get all that to work out and work out well wouldn't be quick. But if we really wanted to do it, we certainly could produce something that's a lot better.
Yeah.
Even if we had to put up with 5 years of turmoil in order to, to work out the bugs to make it work well.
Yeah.
We could. But without the change, without the increase in quality of consciousness to begin with, you'd still have all the same low quality of consciousness players who would still be putting all of their resources into twisting the final product into something that suited them.
Yeah.
You see? Because if that doesn't change, that's all still there. So you still have, $200 or $300 billion, that's going to be trying to manipulate whatever the change is to be suitable to the owners of that, to that money. And are they going to be successful? Of course they're going to be successful. They run things in the sense that they're the chairman of, the head of, the CEO of. These are people that have leverage. They're not only in industry, but they're in government.
Yeah.
And until those minds are changed, the first few changes are probably going to be frustrating because you have this grand idea, but when that actually gets implemented, if it's implemented by people who really don't get it, they're still just trying to twist it to their advantage. You're going to get some kind of twisted thing come out of it. And then you're going to have to work with that. And then you're going to have to work with the thing after that. That's why I say it's not going to be a simple, easy, that's simple. Just throw out the Federal Reserve and throw out this and let's just change that. And we could do it all in a day. It's not reasonable. It's not going to work like that at all. And that's part of the reason that I guess it doesn't catch on as much is that the people who are advocating it, they do have to get the big picture across, but they also have to start defining the path of transforming from what we got to something else.
Yeah.
Down at the detail level, they say, okay, here's what we want to end up, this is what we want to change, but here's what we want to change it to, and here's how that would work in all these other things, and where we probably ought to start with this is here, and then have a plan over 10 years or something that would put it all together. Because big things like economies, national economies, aren't something you just reach out and, it's not like changing a tire on your car.
Yeah, yeah,
It's more complicated than that.
yeah.
So we need more developed plans
Mm-hmm.
that actually show just how to do it.
Yeah.
And because then if you get economists, say, excited about that, because now they see the path.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, before they see the result, and they'll nod their head and say, yeah, but
Mm-hmm.
we can't get that, you can't get to there from here.
Yeah.
It's impossible. It's too entrenched. Well, show them an on-ramp.
Yeah.
Show them a way that it can actually be done. And then if you get them excited about it, they'll get other people excited about it. And if those guys kind of join in with working on the process to get there, the process will be a whole lot more likely to actually take place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You
Yeah.
can't just impose it.
Yes.
It's not like we can just impose it or something.
Yeah.
So how are we really going to do this thing? And what are the steps? And let's try to sell that to not necessarily the public right away, but maybe economists,
Yeah.
maybe, politicians, maybe somebody we can do. But if none of it works, then well, I shouldn't say if none of it works, you still have to keep up the pressure on trying to inform the general public as to
Yeah.
the big problem. Now, the general public doesn't have what it takes to understand the details of how this is actually going to work, but they do have what it takes to understand how it is they're getting,
Mm-hmm.
disadvantaged by this system.
Yes.
So that's a thing, but first you have to get their attention.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's not easy to do.
Yeah.
Takes money
Mm-hmm.
to start running, your own propaganda on the airwaves. Your own construction of the way reality needs to be.
Yeah. Yes.
So anyway, that's my thought about it. Nice ideas. Yeah, I approve. Yeah, I support it, but you got to see that you don't want to just do symptomatic band-aid
Yeah.
changes, and it's not all that simple because it's entrenched with the way we are and the quality of our consciousness, and that's the root. And I guess the thing to say here is that if we focused on increasing the quality of consciousness of the population, we could get to all these things
Yeah.
a lot quicker than if we instead use fear to get people whipped up about it. Because if we use fear to get people whipped up about it,
Yeah.
we're going the wrong direction
Mm.
because it won't really work. That's like replacing the dictator we have now with another dictator.
Yeah.
You see, it just won't work. Okay, you get a lot of people whipped up with fear about it. I'm going to get rid of that damn Federal Reserve, get everybody excited because you got them up in fear. They're angry. It won't work. The long-term prognosis for that is bad. It's not a good prognosis. It won't turn into what you think.
Yeah.
It's because you started doing the wrong thing. You've created more fear. You see, not less.
Yeah.
Well, how do you get the crowd whipped up to demand it if you don't use fear? Because fear is what motivates people, right? See, well, that's problem one. You need to do it without using fear. You need to do it. You need to find another process. Most of these things, they basically are fear-based. Try to get people angry. Try to get them upset so that they want to change. But the whole problem that created the problem in the first place is the fear in the culture. And creating more fear isn't on the path to a real solution. It's on the path to an imagined solution.
Yeah.
Putting in the new guy, getting rid of the dictator and putting in the new guy who's going to give us all freedom. You see, that's a hopeful, but it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Because that new guy that wants to give everybody freedom isn't going to last long if he really does want to give everybody freedom, because there's going to be somebody that's going to knock him off and take over control.
Yes.
Because that's the nature of the beast. You
Yes.
see, it just isn't going to work well. You're going to end up with something else other than what you think. It sounds good,
Yeah.
but it's very Pollyanna, and it isn't good. And if you try to make these things happen by using fear, that's like trying to put out a fire with a flamethrower. It isn't gonna work. So I guess that's kind of my big point on these things, that you have to realize that doing a symptomatic relief, put a Band-Aid on it, doesn't have any long-term thing.
Yeah.
And if you don't change the fundamental quality of the consciousness of the population, nothing is going to work for long.
Yeah.
So, and fear is using the wrong tools. So getting people whipped up with fear is counterproductive, not productive.
Yes. I'd like to ask you about technological development and risks that are involved in technological development, the future. I'd like to ask you about the technological singularity and existential risks. The technological singularity is a theoretical emergence of superintelligence that is far more intelligent than human intelligence. The technological singularity is seen an occurrence beyond which events cannot be predicted, since the capabilities and motivations of a superintelligence would be difficult for an unaided human mind to comprehend. A technological singularity includes often the concept of an intelligence explosion, a term coined by 1965 by I.G. Good. If a superhuman intelligence were to be invented, either through the amplification of human intelligence or through artificial intelligence, it would bring to bear greater problem solving and inventive skills than current humans are capable of. It could then design an even more capable machine or rewrite its own software to become even more intelligent. This more capable machine could then go to design a machine of yet greater capability. These iterations of recursive self-improvement could accelerate, potentially allowing enormous qualitative change before any upper limits imposed by the laws of physics or theoretical computation set in. It is unclear whether an intelligence explosion of this kind would be beneficial or harmful, or even an existential risk. The director of Future of Humanity Institute, Professor Nick Bostrom, defines an existential risk as follows. An existential risk is one that threatens the premature extinction of Earth-originating intelligent life or the permanent and drastic destruction of its potential for desirable future development. What is your view on the technological singularity and existential risks?
Okay, that's a very interesting subject. I have a couple of things about it.
Yes.
One, we tend to see intelligence as a tool. Okay, it's a tool, and like any tool, then it can be used for good or for bad.
Yeah.
Okay. However, if we're talking about what I'll call fundamental or actual intelligence, and not just the ability to build better tools. You know, I'm talking about technical prowess, someone that's highly trainable or highly educatable, or someone or something highly educatable. Okay, then there probably is no problem. If we're really talking about intelligence, and not just technical prowess and highly trainable, then intelligence, real intelligence, sees bigger pictures. It not only thinks about how to solve the problem, but it sees the problem in a context of, you know, what might happen next and what that might cause. And it looks at a bigger picture. It sees things in terms of not only ethical and moral contexts, but also, you know, in sociological context, psychological context, all that sort of stuff. So if they're really, really intelligent, you see these bigger pictures. Now, if you're not really intelligent, but you're just really highly technical, highly trainable, and highly educatable, that means you can get into this loop that you talked about. You know, you can educate and be really smart about, you know, building things and solving problems, and then you can find ways to even be smarter and smarter because you're highly educatable, trainable. But that's different than being intelligent. So I'm really kind of begging the question over this word intelligent. You say, what does it really mean to say they're highly intelligent? If they're really intelligent, they see bigger pictures. A bigger picture, then they will mitigate, or they will control their own interests and their own things of what they do. What are they going to create? Because they're looking about how is this creation going to interact with humanity? Is it good? Is it bad? Where does it lead? To a good place or a bad place? So people who are really intelligent tend to automatically move toward higher quality, because higher quality is the more intelligent choice in the long term.
Yeah.
You see, low quality tends to move to the short term. What's in it for me now? What do I get? And how am I going to arrange this so, I get the most stuff? That's the way a low quality, person, a low quality consciousness acts. It tends to be very short term. More intelligent person sees things in not a bigger picture. That means in the long term. How does this affect things 100 years from now? What kind of trends does this set in motion? Where is it going? What are the risks? So a really intelligent person will do really good risk assessment.
Yes.
Consider all these things. A really intelligent person will realize that morality and ethics is important to long-term benefit. That you can do things that are immoral for short-term benefit, but in the end, it doesn't work. It self-destructs. It doesn't leave you with a better place. It leaves you in a worse place. If you go into the future. So that's the thing. So if you have really intelligent people, they tend to say, fear is dysfunctional.
Yeah.
I don't want to, love is functional. Fear tears things apart. Cooperation pulls things together. A really intelligent person would see that. And if they saw that, they would try to grow toward that end, you see. Now, a person who's not really intelligent, who is very educatable and very trainable, that means they have a good mind. If they're low quality, then they're going to use that mind to create things that make them more powerful, give them more stuff, that's good for them. And they don't really care who it hurts or what it does in the long term. Long term's not in their mind. Long term, they'll have so much they can isolate themselves from all the trouble they cause and, live in a little bubble and everything will be fine. You see, they really don't care much. So I'd say if we look at fundamental intelligence, I'd say there's not really going to be a problem because it's just more intelligent to cooperate than it is to control.
Yeah.
Because the long term is so much better. You see? So any great intelligence that wants to work on a fear-based thing, well, I'm saying they're not really all that intelligent. They've got a lot of skills, but they're not all that intelligent, or they would realize that they're just shooting themselves in the foot by being so greedy.
Yeah.
All right, so that's one thing. Okay, now we humans of the 21st century can't tell the difference and confuse the two. The highly intelligent versus the highly trainable and educatable. We don't see those as two different things. We just see them as one thing. That being intelligent means that you're highly trainable and educatable. See? And there's a problem there. Okay. And obviously, an example of that is we create IQ tests based on the accumulation of facts.
Yes.
You happen to have a whole bunch of facts accumulated because you've been an avid reader and this and that and a good memory. Well, that makes you highly trainable and educable, okay? But you show up with a real high IQ. Well, that's not intelligence. That's skill.
Yeah.
It's like the difference between somebody who thinks and somebody who has learned how to make a bomb, or learned how to do something, learned how to manipulate people, say, learned how to be a good propagandist.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the difference. Being highly trainable and educable is somewhat correlated with intelligence. Those two things kind of go together, but it's two different things altogether. All right, now let's look at how they both could play out. If fundamental intelligence blossoms, we may be fine. That may take care of itself because a really intelligent person would see that fear is not the answer, that love is. Okay. The quality of consciousness will blossom if that takes place, if there's enough quality of consciousness to build on. If you have basically enough quality of consciousness that someone can think the thoughts that takes them to the conclusion that love is a better answer than fear, okay, then the higher intelligent person will probably move toward love. But if there's not enough quality in the culture to build upon, okay, we're still, we are a very high entropy species, right? At the present time, then it's likely that we will constrain ourselves to only build better tools and quickly improve them until our quality improves enough to allow us to see a bigger picture. Well, that's sort of where we are now, right? We got a low quality of consciousness population, and what we do is we build bigger and better tools that help us make bigger and better tools, and that's our focus until we grow up enough that we can see a bigger picture.
Yeah.
Now, a very intelligent being ought to be able to see that bigger picture more easily. That's the mitigating factor in all of this. But those two don't have to travel together. You can have people who are very good at manipulating stuff that just aren't very bright.
Yeah.
They're just not very intelligent. They don't see big pictures. We've seen that over and over again. And they'll make a big splash on the the bad or the evil side of things. And they may be very, very rich, or they may be very, very powerful, or they may run 10 different countries. They may have gotten all sorts of success. But you see what happens. It all goes away. It doesn't persist. Kind of to summarize that all up, it's possible that low quality of consciousness humans could build a low quality of conscious computer that eventually exterminates humanity.
Yeah.
That's a possibility. But it is my opinion that that's extremely unlikely. It makes a good movie plot, but it's actually not all that scary. I don't see that as any long-term threat to humanity.
Yeah.
And I say that for a couple of reasons.
Yes.
One, there's a very long time between when a computer is conscious and is acting as our, what do we call it, working for us, so to speak, to where it can take over on its own.
Yeah.
Computers are very dependent on us to feed them. We have to feed them electricity. We have to feed them power. And feeding them power is a very complex, with supply chain, if you will. Starts from digging ore out of the ground and putting in power plants and so on. And though robots can do all that, they don't do it overnight. That's a long, there's a lot of hours and a lot of days and years in that process. So if the computers get scary, unless they are really sweet right up until the day, that they get scary, then we ought to be able to pull the plug. We ought to be aware enough of the possibilities that we create software that has its own boundaries.
Yeah.
So it's not that hard a problem to fix, I guess is what I'm saying. You can design limitations. Whatever you build, you can build the limitations there that gets you what you want and avoids putting you at risk. So I don't think it's that hard to keep that from happening. But in the long term, when we talk about humanity, remember humanity isn't consciousness. It's just the avatars. Humanity is just a bunch of avatars in a digital simulation.
Yeah.
This digital simulation is being run by the larger consciousness system because it has these avatars that we can play to help us make choices and evolve the quality of our consciousness, right? That's the system. That's why it's there. That's what it's doing. Okay? Now, a computer that is conscious, if you create a computer that makes free will choices as well, Well, that's just another consciousness, right?
Yeah.
That's another consciousness. And that consciousness also is in the non-physical world. That computer body, that hard drive, that silicon or whatever it's made of, that is its avatar,
Yep.
if you will. It's a consciousness that is limited by the abilities of its avatar. Just like our consciousness can only, make choices within the bounds of what our avatar can carry out.
Yeah.
I can't tell my avatar, flap your arms and fly up into the sky, because my avatar can't carry that out.
Yeah.
You see? So we also have a consciousness that is, if you will, making the choices behind the sentient or conscious computer, and that computer is its digital simulation avatar.
Yeah.
Okay? So it's all consciousness. If you have a conscious computer, it's really no different than a conscious human.
Yeah.
It's just two different animals with two different kinds of constraints of what they can do.
Yeah.
The computer consciousness can count from 1 to 3 trillion very quickly. It takes our, flesh and blood avatar a long time to count that far. Probably longer than their lifespan to count that far, you see, and that computer might do that in a millisecond.
Yeah.
So we have different skills and different things that we can do, but it's still just consciousness.
Yeah.
So as long as this virtual reality makes a good schoolhouse for the evolution of consciousness, it'll just keep chugging right along. And whether that consciousness is just human consciousness, but if it's some other consciousness, just human consciousness is just an IUOC with a human avatar.
Yeah.
Computer consciousness is just consciousness, an IUOC with a machine, what we would call a machine avatar. So what's the difference? It's all consciousness. We're here for consciousness to make choices. Now, if the machine avatar turns out to be real interactive, to where it can learn a lot through the interactions of whatever, with other machines, with people or whatever, that may be just as viable a learning lab for consciousness as human avatars. See, if you see it in that picture, it's a little different scheme. It's not us against the machines. It's a whole bunch of consciousness in varied forms with varied constraints, and where it's helpful to the larger consciousness system to help evolve consciousness, that will be allowed, that will be encouraged, that will happen.
Yeah.
Where it is dysfunctional for the larger conscious system, because it kind of ruins this learning lab, because computers don't really interact with computers. They just, whatever. And a computer consciousness isn't nearly as fast a learner as, these avatars. Well, that's like when you play World of Warcraft. You get to choose. You can be a this kind of character or that kind of character. You got different sorts of things, and the ones that you can run your points up. You can be a level. Run your levels up. That's the character that gets played, right? The ones that you can forward, that seem to learn and grow and become better. So if you want to get your character from initial character of level 1 up to a level 50. Well, then you don't pick a character that doesn't do that very well.
Yeah.
Right? So then those characters don't get played. But it doesn't matter. So what I'm saying is that the characters that enable consciousness to grow will be the ones that get played.
Yeah.
Now, whether that shifts from human to something else, what difference does it make? This whole thing is a simulator for the evolution of consciousness.
Yes.
It's not really a big problem. So it'll be whatever it is. And if it starts to get to the point that a suboptimal avatar is kind of taking over, therefore the learning room or the learning lab that we have, our schoolhouse, is getting less and less effective because we have more and more avatars that don't learn well or that don't evolve the quality of their consciousness very well. Well, then that means the schoolhouse is starting to become ineffective for the larger conscious system. That's an easy thing for a larger consciousness system who's running this computer and running the game to change.
Yeah.
That can be changed in a heartbeat. So it's just not a problem. What will happen is whatever is more optimal for the evolution of the quality of consciousness, for becoming love. That's what will happen. And whether it happens in human form or some other form is really irrelevant. Doesn't make any difference. Whatever form works.
Yeah.
Whatever form provides the optimal avatar for consciousness evolution, for becoming love, that's what will eventually get adopted.
Yeah.
And 3 cheers for whatever that is. And things that are not helpful to evolving the quality of consciousness and becoming love, well, go away. That's how evolution works. So, see, we finally, with this virtual reality, with this simulation, we ended up with these human avatars. It's about time. Waited a long time to get an avatar that would really be good at allowing individuated units of consciousness to grow up, to become love. Okay, this human avatar is really a good vehicle for that.
Yeah.
Well, might there be better vehicles for that we might evolve? Maybe. Maybe not. Who knows? The answer may be no, the humans are about as optimal an avatar for, for this game that we're in, this consciousness evolution become love game. They may be the optimal, in which case humans will always be around. If machines got too big a role, the system would just change that.
Yeah.
You know, right? I mean, if you're the people who run the server in World of Warcraft, and suddenly the characters that don't do well are just, there's too many of them, so you can be you can be all these other characters that really progress well, but now we have this character called the Rock, and it doesn't do much. It just can't do much. But now there's only a couple of those elves around, and there's all sorts of rocks. Yeah. But I run the server, and I'm the programmer. What am I going to do about that? That's easy. I just get rid of them.
Yeah.
I just change them out. I tilt the balance so that they become less and the others become more. I fix the game to be what I want it to be.
Yeah.
So you see, it's just not a problem. So that's why I say it's not really scary. However it works out for the best. It will be optimum. Now, the reason I come to that conclusion, and Nick Bostrom comes to this could be a really scary thing conclusion, is because Nick Bostrom doesn't see the nature of reality like I do.
Yeah.
Nick Bostrom doesn't have the concept that there's more to this physical reality than physical reality. Yeah. He doesn't understand consciousness or how it works. So that's the difference. Yeah. So he's limited. So I don't think, you see, that's why I say it. Yeah, it's possible that a machine may eliminate humanity or whatever, but so what? It only is going to do that if it's really a better avatar for evolving toward love. Yeah. And then fine, there's no problem. Yeah, yeah. I mean, we weren't always around either. It wasn't always humans. Humans came on, and then we were the avatar of choice. Yeah. But there's still dogs and cats and monkeys and all kinds of other things, and bumblebees that they still have consciousness, and they still evolving in their own way. But they're just not fast track like we human avatars are. Yeah. Well. So now the human avatars kind of lots of them around, and we're doing well. Yeah. The Future of Humanity Institute and the Machine Intelligence Research Institute are two of the leading institutions in the world researching existential risks. And you go a little bit about that, and the Future Humanity Institute explores risks and opportunities that will arrive and so on. And then you talk about the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, a nonprofit organization funded to develop safe artificial intelligence software and to raise awareness of both the dangers and potential benefits it believes AI presents. Its core mission is to ensure that the creation of smarter than human intelligence benefits society. Okay, my comment on that is, of course, that's a good idea. That's the idea of, hey, people, these things might have far-ranging implications. We should think about them. Yeah. Yeah. Well, 3 cheers for that. I agree. Good idea. We do need to think about them. And Nick Bostrom is one of the people who's chanting that and saying that more right now, I think, than almost anybody else. Hey, we got to think about these things. You know, let's not be caught unaware of what's going on. Let's think about them. Well, that is a really good idea. However, without an understanding of the nature of reality, who we are, what we are, our purpose, the digital nature of reality, etc., the results of this thinking about them are mostly an exercise in the blind leading the blind, like a class of elementary education majors developing a plan for the exploration of outer space as a class project. You see, that's the problem. You have the people who want to think about these ideas, very good, but they don't understand enough about the nature of reality, the nature of humanity, the nature of consciousness to actually, you know, look at them in a productive way. They're off doing what ifs and doing their analysis based on this universe is the only universe we have. Physical reality is all the reality there is. Physical reality is fundamental. Everything else, you know, is derived from physical reality and so on. And if you have these thoughts, if you don't see there is a big picture, you see, then that's why you confuse intelligence with, you know, being easily trainable and educable. They're not the same. If you have a big picture, you start seeing a whole different way of looking at the problem. So my thought basically on those kind of institutes is I think they are well-meaning. I think they're absolutely necessary. I think these are important things to think about, but unfortunately the people thinking about them don't really know enough to say anything particularly informative or interesting other than formulating the problem. They can kind of formulate the problem, but even then the problem is out of context because they don't have the basic context. They don't understand the nature of reality enough to have a good context by which to even work the problem in. So that's the problem. You can't take a whole bunch of elementary education majors and freshmen in college and say, hey guys, as a class project, why don't you develop the plan for their exploration of outer space? They don't know how to start. They don't have the concepts. They don't know about developing a faster than light speed engine, you know. I mean, they can make stuff up. And they can do a lot of you know, just make up things and make up assumptions and so on, but it doesn't really amount to anything. And that's the problem I have with, you know, the Machine Intelligence Research Institute and the Future of Humanity Institute and all these. Yay, guys, we do need to think about it. You're absolutely right, but you're not really helping a whole lot because you don't really understand the context in which the problem exists. So I'm sorry, it makes me kind of harsh on these guys. And I really like them, and I like Nick Bostrom because when I said when we first started this conversation, there was only 2 other people I knew of that thought we probably lived in a virtual reality. Well, Nick Bostrom was one of those 2. He was one of the earlier ones that said we may be living in a simulation. You see, so I've known about Nick for a long time before he was into this, you know, this idea, future humanity. But and he's a real smart guy, and I think a lot of Nick, but he just doesn't have the big picture. And for the things he's doing, they're big picture things. I mean, all these questions he's asking are big picture questions. And if you don't have the big picture and you're trying to answer big picture questions, it's just a problem. So that's Tom Campbell's opinion of it. Of course, Tom Campbell, you see, is the virtual reality larger conscious system guy. So from my perspective, that's the way I see it. And from Nick Bostrom's perspective, who doesn't probably even know that Tom Campbell exists or that there is this theory of consciousness or anything else, he's probably not even aware of that existence. You know, from his viewpoint, he's doing the best he can with what little information he's got. And I salute him. You know, Nick, keep going, guy. But when I look at it, I just see a mismatch of not understanding the big picture and therefore not being able to make good sense of this. It's not a worry that human beings might be eliminated by whatever because That's only going to happen if that's good,
Yeah.
because the larger consciousness system controls the simulation.
Yes.
And if it's good, that's good. But my guess is that probably, so that's why I say it's nothing really to worry about. It's not a problem.
Yeah.
But if you only think of it in terms of people the way they are now, full of fear and belief and ego, and all they want to, all it is, it's all about themselves and power. And then you think, well, all this technology in the minds of these greedy, fearful people, what's going to happen? You say, well, that's true. It's something worth worrying about.
Yeah.
But all right, what's the solution? The solution is, let's have a lot fewer greedy, fearful, egotistical people.
Yeah.
That's the real solution to these problems.
Yeah.
Not, building a bigger wall to keep the barbarians out. The solution is to educate the barbarians. The solution is to make so there are no barbarians.
Yeah. Yeah.
So again, all of the problems for the future of humanity are solved in, let's raise the quality of consciousness of those of us who are here.
Yeah.
That solves all of these problems. And we talked about education, and what was the solution? Well, basically, you got to increase the quality of consciousness. We talk about economics. What's the solution? Well, basically, you got to raise the quality of consciousness. You talk about future of humanity. What's really the solution so that's a good future? Well, you got to raise the quality of consciousness. So you see, it's a very simple model. And, you get to the point that it's like you only got one answer.
Yeah.
And that's raise the quality of consciousness. But it's true, because that's what we are. This is about consciousness.
Yeah.
So that is turns out to be the one answer. Love is the answer, right? Answers all the problems. What's the problem? Tell me what your problem is. Is it education? Is it economics? Is it the future of humanity? Love is the answer. You see, it's the answer to all the problems, because we are consciousness. That's who we really are, and this is a consciousness system. It's not a physical system. That's just the calculated bunch of avatars and the stuff to support them.
I'd like to ask you about your lectures and your YouTube videos. I think one of your best MBT lectures is the Calgary lecture, a 3-day workshop entitled Reality 101 that you presented at the University of Calgary between September 23rd to September 25th, 2011. In the Calgary lecture, you talk about many of my big toe's essential concepts like open-minded skepticism, beliefs, consciousness, evolution, the difference between reality and models of reality, limits of knowledge, the difference between a little toe and a big toe, objectivity and subjectivity, will, intent, decision space, fear, ego, love, free will, out-of-body experience, paranormal, healing, spiritual growth, meditation, the larger consciousness system, virtual reality, physical matter reality and non-physical matter reality, and the difference between the intellectual level and the being level. What other MBT lectures and your YouTube videos would you recommend for those who want to know more about your My Big Toe?
Okay, first of all, I would agree with your selection. The Calgary lecture is really a very good one to get the best overall summary. And if all you want's a short summary, well, in that lecture, the very first day on a Friday was a short summary. Now, for me, you have to understand when I say short, I'm talking, 2.5 hours. That's short. So it's still a pretty long video, but that gives kind of a short summary of the whole thing. And then the next day, Saturday, talks all about the theory, how it works, why it works, what's reality and why is it like that, and so on. And then the third day is about application, which is how do you get to experience the larger consciousness system? Because again, I don't want you to believe any of the things I tell you. I want you to go experience them. There has to be your big toe. You can't just can't believe my big toe. It's got, people have to know. So I have to give them an on-ramp. How are they going to get to the point that it is theirs. And so we talk about things like remote viewing and healing, and I give instructions how to do these things, and so on. So that's the Calgary, and that is a very good one.
Yeah.
The other ones, well, I should say maybe that at first, that just to give the overall view of my videos on YouTube, I've got right now probably about 210, 215
Yeah, you have a lot of
videos
YouTube
on
videos.
YouTube.
Yeah.
That's a lot of videos.
Yeah.
A lot of those videos are multiple hours long. This one you're talking about, Calgary lecture, you know, the first day is like 2.5, 3 hours. Saturday is probably 7 or 8 hours, and Sunday is probably like 6 hours. So to go through that whole thing, you have to add all those up. That's a lot of video listening, and it puts a lot of people off because it's so much. But this is a big theory of everything, and you just can't, you know, the 25-word or less version just is incomprehensible and doesn't mean anything. There's a lot of paradigms that have to change, and changing a paradigm means changing the way you view something, your whole perspective in looking at something. That can't be done quickly. That takes time and effort, and it's not only effort on my part, but effort on your part, thinking about it. So if you spend 14 hours with the Calgary lecture 3 days, you probably have to spend 3 times that much thinking about it before much of it will actually make sense to you. So it is an investment. I do have some of my videos that are like 15 minutes and 20 minutes and pieces, but not a lot of them. Those are usually very subject specific.
Yes.
Okay, but what I would suggest that people look for, if they want a quick summary, they should probably, they also could take a look at the Hawaii workshop I did.
Yeah.
The Saturday I did that. I did a kind of a quick overall, ran through that real quick. The very first one I ever did, my first talk, which was
it was in England, was it?
Was in England, was in London. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
the London lecture, physics,
Yeah.
consciousness, physics, and the nature of it. What was it? Physics, metaphysics, and the nature of reality. That was the London one. Now, that's not as long. See, that's just maybe 2 hours or so, and that gives kind of a summary. But all of them are a little different. I'm going over the same material, but what I would recommend to people that are kind of the newer ones, if you're a beginner and just getting started in it, a good place to begin would be with the 3-day event I gave in Mexico.
Yeah.
Because in Mexico, everybody there was a Spanish speaker. Not everybody, but most of the people there. My books aren't in Spanish. My videos aren't in Spanish. So that means everybody there was pretty much new to, you know, the concepts.
Yeah.
So I tried to start from the beginning, and I didn't dig real deeply, but I hit a lot of subjects. So it's a good broad you know, treatment for beginners.
Yeah.
So and that is in Spanish now. You can get that in Spanish, but so it's in English and Spanish. So the Mexican one would be a good one for beginners, and the last 2 presentations for a little more advanced students. Not the last one, the one before last I did in Spokane, Washington.
Yeah.
And I spent a little more time talking about the origins of the larger consciousness system, a little more detail. I went into a little more detail about you know, how do we change our reality, because that was college students there, and we know college students are all geared up to go out and remake the world, you know, change it, make it a better place. And I tried to give them some of the approaches that worked there, and then there was a lot of good Q&A after that. And then the last one I did was in the Rocket Center in Huntsville, and I think that was called Advanced Open Forum or something like that. And there I spent the first couple of hours giving more detail on what exactly it means to be a probabilistic simulation. You know, what does that mean? And I talked a little about evolution and the fact that it's not just entirely random selection and random mutations, but there's also intent-based mutations, if you will, that are going on, and how that works, and how the evolution is really a skewed process based on intent, and a couple of other things that I went into a little more detail there. So Mexico for beginners, then probably do Calgary to fill in all the detail, and then probably go to Spokane and to the Advanced Open Forum in order to fill in some of the more technical details that makes your understanding just a little more sound. So that would be probably what I'd recommend to most people.
Right.
But there is a lot of stuff there.
Yeah.
Don't let the length of it put you off. You have to look at it this way. I don't recommend that you sit down and watch Calgary from beginning to end all in 2 days. You can't do it probably all. Well, you could do it all in one day. You actually could do it all in one day. I think it all together is about 14 hours. So you could do that in one day. I don't recommend that. You won't come away with much that way. You have to approach these things with, listen to it for about 20 or 30 minutes, and then let it go. Because in 20 or 30 minutes, you'll have enough to think about for a few days, if not a few weeks. And then come back and listen to it a little more. And don't be afraid to listen to the same piece twice. In other words, work your way through it slowly. Listen, re-listen, because you'll find that if you listen to it once, you get maybe 30% of it. If you listen to it the second time, you get maybe 70% of it. You listen to it a third time, you get maybe 85% of it. And every time you listen to it, if you're really trying...
It's the same with the books. It's the same with the trilogy.
It's the same with the books. And that's the other thing. You can always go read the books. They're free on Google Books, and they don't cost that much to buy. You can get them from Amazon or get them from our website. But you get all the books, all 3 books in one paperback binding is the cheapest way to get them. That's like $25.50, which means they're just slightly over $8 a piece for the books. That's pretty inexpensive for books, and it's a really good binding, so they won't fall apart. They'll last pretty well. But yes, it works the same way. You read the books once, you get maybe 20-30%. You read them again, you go up to maybe 60%.
I've noticed it myself. I read it a couple of times.
It's just because these things that are dealing with paradigm shifts, it's not until you think about them and live with them for a while that you can actually get them.
Yes. Well, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the interview. And do you have something to say? Still something to say?
No, I'm done. Okay.
All right. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Bye, Tom.
Bye.
Bye.